My parents locked me out in the freezing snow for refusing to cook my brother a midnight snack. "Servants sleep outside," my mother shouted, her face twisted with a cruelty I had known my entire life. Through the frost-covered glass of our Aspen estate, I watched my brother wave from his heated room holding a glass of wine. "Maybe the cold will teach you some respect," he mouthed through the window. I stood shivering in a thin sweater, the icy wind biting into my skin, but I did not cry, because they had no idea their little stunt was about to cost them absolutely everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a toxic family that pushed you past your breaking point. My name is Naomi, and I am 33 years old. For as long as I can remember, my family treated me less like a daughter and more like an unpaid employee. We were spending the holidays at my parents' massive winter estate in Aspen, Colorado. It was a sprawling modern lodge with floor-to-ceiling windows, heated stone floors, and a kitchen that belonged in a five-star restaurant. But while the rest of the family spent Christmas Eve sipping expensive champagne by the fire and exchanging lavish gifts, I was confined to that kitchen. I had spent 8 grueling hours on my feet, preparing a flawless holiday feast for my parents, Richard and Patricia, my older brother Trent, and their assorted high society guests. I roasted a prime rib, prepared lobster tails, and baked 4 different desserts from scratch. Not once did anyone offer to help. Not once did anyone say thank you. When the guests finally left around midnight, I was left to scrub the pots, load the dishwashers, and wipe down the marble counters until my hands ached. It was 1 in the morning by the time I finally finished. Every muscle in my back was screaming for rest. I had just poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the island when the heavy oak front door slammed open. Trent stumbled in, tracking snow across the freshly mopped entryway. At 35 years old, Trent was the undisputed golden child of the family. He ran some tech startup that was constantly burning through our parents' money, but to them, he was a genius who could do no wrong. He smelled of expensive bourbon and cigar smoke, clearly having just returned from an exclusive bar down in the village. He slurred my name, tossing his designer coat onto a bar stool. "Naomi, I am starving. Get the pan hot. I want that Wagyu ribeye Mom bought yesterday. Cook it medium rare, and do not mess up the crust this time." I stared at him, my exhaustion instantly morphing into disbelief. "Trent, it is 1 in the morning. I have been cooking and cleaning for 10 hours straight. The kitchen is closed. Make yourself a sandwich." His arrogant smirk faltered, replaced by the petulant scowl he always wore when denied his way. "I did not ask for a sandwich. I told you to cook the steak. That is literally what you are here for. Do not be useless." "I am not cooking a steak at 1 in the morning," I said firmly, turning to walk toward the stairs. "You are perfectly capable of turning on a stove." "What is all this yelling?" a sharp voice echoed from the top of the stairs. My mother, Patricia, descended the sweeping staircase, tightening her silk robe. Even in the middle of the night, her posture was rigid with judgment. "Mom," Trent whined, his voice taking on a childish pitch that made my stomach turn. "Naomi is refusing to cook me dinner. I just got back from a critical networking event in town and I am exhausted, but she is throwing a tantrum." Patricia did not even look at Trent, her furious gaze locked entirely on me. I watched her march across the kitchen, her eyes blazing with that familiar, irrational anger she reserved only for me. "Excuse me?" Patricia snapped, stepping so close I could smell her expensive night cream. "Who do you think you are talking to your brother that way? He is a CEO. He is out there building a legacy for this family, and you cannot even manage to fry a piece of meat for him?" "Mom, I cooked all day," I protested, struggling to keep my voice level. "I made a massive dinner for 20 people. I just cleaned this entire kitchen. He can make his own food." Patricia scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "You are a glorified line cook, Naomi. You chop vegetables and stir pots. Do not act like you are running a multinational corporation." We let you stay in this magnificent home out of pity. We pay for the groceries. We put a roof over your head. The least you can do is make yourself useful to the people in this family who actually matter." I felt a familiar knot forming in my chest. This was always her tactic: to diminish, to belittle, to remind me that my career in the culinary world was somehow a shameful mark on our family tree. "I am not an unpaid servant," I said, my voice dropping to a cold whisper, "and I am going to sleep." I turned away from her, reaching for the small bowl on the counter where I kept my room keys and my car keys. But before my fingers could graze the metal, Patricia lunged forward. She snatched the entire bowl, keys and all. With her other hand, she grabbed my thin wool cardigan off the back of the dining chair. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping back. Patricia did not answer. She marched to the heavy glass back door that led to the patio and the freezing mountain wilderness beyond. She yanked the door open. A blast of sub-zero wind howled into the warm kitchen, bringing a flurry of snowflakes with it. With a violent jerk of her arm, she hurled my keys and my sweater straight into the darkness of the blizzard. "Get out," she hissed, grabbing my shoulder and physically shoving me toward the open door. "Mom, stop!" I shouted, stumbling backward as my bare feet hit the icy stone of the patio. "It is -10 degrees out here. You want to act like you are too good to serve this family?" Patricia screamed, her face contorted with rage. "Then you can learn what it means to be cut off. You think you are so independent? Let us see how independent you are freezing in the snow." Before I could process the sheer lunacy of her actions, she gave me one final, vicious shove. I slipped on a patch of ice and fell backward onto the snow-covered patio deck. The heavy glass door slammed shut, and the unmistakable click of the deadbolt echoed through the freezing air. I scrambled to my feet, my breath instantly turning to white clouds in the frigid night. I pounded on the thick glass, the cold already beginning to bite violently into my bare arms and face. Through the window, I could see Patricia glaring at me, her arms crossed over her chest. "Servants sleep outside," she shouted, her voice muffled but perfectly clear through the heavy glass. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me stranded in the dark. I looked up toward the second floor. The light in Trent's room clicked on. He stood at his window, looking down at me in the blizzard. He took a sip from his glass of bourbon, smiled, and gave me a slow, mocking wave before closing his blinds. The cold was absolute, piercing through my thin clothes like thousands of tiny needles. But as the freezing wind whipped my hair across my face, the panic in my chest was rapidly being swallowed by something else, a profound, unbreakable rage. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had finally put me in my place. But they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with today. The wind howled around me, tearing through the thin fabric of my sweater like it was made of paper. My bare feet stood on the frozen stone of the patio, losing sensation with every passing second. I looked up at the second-floor window. Trent was still there. He raised his glass of red wine in a mock toast, a smug, satisfied grin plastered across his face. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to fall to my knees in the snow and beg for forgiveness, to hammer my fists against the reinforced glass and apologize for disrespecting his fragile ego. I stared right back at him, my expression completely blank. I refused to shed a single tear. I refused to shiver where he could see me. I turned my back on his window and marched off the patio directly into the knee-deep snow of the backyard. The shock of the freezing powder against my bare skin was agonizing. It felt like walking on jagged, broken glass. My toes burned intensely, a sharp, searing pain that radiated up my calves before going entirely numb. I knew exactly how dangerous this situation was. Aspen nights during a high-altitude blizzard were unforgiving. People died in these temperatures in a matter of minutes. My mother had not just kicked me out during a minor argument. She had actively and knowingly endangered my life. I trudged around the perimeter of the massive estate, fighting the fierce wind that threatened to knock me over. The house was enormous, a sprawling fortress of timber and stone, and every single entrance was secured. The front door was locked tight. The guest entrances were deadbolted from the inside. My breathing grew shallow, my chest tightening painfully as the icy air filled my lungs. I needed shelter immediately, or I was going to lose my fingers and toes. I rounded the corner toward the expansive four-car garage. There was a small service door on the side, flanked by a narrow, reinforced glass window. I tried the heavy metal handle. Locked. My hands were turning a dangerous shade of blue-purple, the joints stiffening. I had no tools, no heavy boots to kick the solid core door down, and my muscles were rapidly seizing from the extreme cold. I scanned the snow-covered landscaping and spotted a heavy decorative stone planter near the edge of the paved driveway. I dragged myself over to it, my bare feet leaving bloody footprints in the pristine white snow. My fingers could barely grip the icy, rough surface of the stone, but pure adrenaline and survival instinct fueled my movements. I hoisted the heavy stone up, gritting my teeth against the shooting pain in my frozen shoulders. I stumbled back to the service door window. With a sharp exhale, I swung the stone with every ounce of strength I had left, smashing it directly into the center of the glass pane. The glass shattered inward with a loud, satisfying crash, sending sharp fragments scattering across the dark concrete garage floor. I did not care if the noise woke up the entire house. Let them hear it. I carefully reached my freezing arm through the jagged opening, feeling for the interior deadbolt. A sharp piece of broken glass sliced deep into the palm of my right hand. Warm blood immediately welled up, but the cold had numbed my skin so thoroughly that I barely registered the pain. My fingers fumbled against the lock, slipping twice on my own blood before finally finding the latch and turning it. I pushed the heavy door open and stumbled inside, collapsing onto the cold floor. The garage was unheated, but the thick walls shielded me from the brutal wind and the blinding snow. I lay there for a moment, gasping for air, clutching my bleeding hand to my chest. I scanned the dim space, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. I spotted a stack of heavy-duty quilted moving blankets piled near a row of cardboard storage boxes. I dragged my battered body over to them, pulling 3 thick blankets down and wrapping them tightly around my violently shivering frame. I tucked my bleeding hand inside the layers, trying to preserve whatever body heat I had left. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was freezing cold to the touch, and my stiff fingers struggled to swipe the unlock screen. I did not call my father. I did not call Trent. I did not call anyone inside that house to beg for mercy. I dialed 911. The emergency dispatcher answered almost immediately. I gave her the exact address of the estate in a calm, flat, professional voice. She asked what the nature of the emergency was. "I am reporting an act of domestic violence and reckless endangerment," I stated clearly, my teeth chattering uncontrollably against my will. "I have been intentionally locked out in the snow during a severe blizzard by the homeowners. I am wearing no shoes and no winter clothing. I have sustained lacerations, and I am currently experiencing the early stages of hypothermia." The dispatcher gasped slightly before her training kicked in. She told me to stay on the line, confirming that multiple police units and an ambulance were being dispatched to the location immediately. She asked if I was in a safe location away from my attackers. I told her I had broken into the garage to survive the freezing temperatures, but that the individuals who locked me out were inside the main house. I gave her the names of my parents and my brother. I made sure she noted that they were intoxicated. I hung up the phone and pulled the heavy blankets tighter around my shoulders. I sat on the hard concrete floor, watching the blood from my hand stain the blue quilted fabric. The silence in the garage was deafening, broken only by the howling wind outside. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. The executive part of my brain took over, calculating my next moves with absolute ruthless precision. My family thought I was a helpless culinary worker who would just take their abuse. They were terribly wrong. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The cold seeped into my bones, making me drowsy, but I forced myself to stay awake. Finally, the faint, piercing wail of sirens broke through the sounds of the mountain storm. They were getting closer, echoing down the steep roads, rushing straight toward our private gates. I sat perfectly still in the dark, wrapped in my moving blankets, waiting for the fallout. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the heavy snowfall, illuminating the frosted windows of the garage. I heard the crunch of heavy boots on the icy driveway, followed by the sweep of flashlights across the dark exterior of the house. A bright beam hit the shattered glass of the service door, and a voice called out, demanding anyone inside to identify themselves. I called back, my voice shaking from the bone-deep chill, telling them I was the one who called 911. Two Aspen police officers and a paramedic rushed inside. They found me huddled against the cardboard boxes, shivering violently under the blood-stained moving blankets. The paramedic immediately dropped to his knees, shining a penlight into my eyes and assessing my pale, blue-tinged face. One of the officers gently peeled back the blanket to examine my right hand, which was still bleeding sluggishly from the deep glass cut. He took one look at my bare, frostbitten feet and cursed under his breath. They wrapped me in a thermal foil blanket and began administering first aid right there on the concrete floor. The senior officer asked me to confirm exactly who had locked me out. I gave him my parents' names, Richard and Patricia, and explained that they were currently inside the main house. Leaving me with the paramedic, the two officers marched out of the garage and up to the grand front entrance of the estate. They did not ring the doorbell politely. They pounded on the heavy oak door with the force of absolute authority. It took a full minute before the outdoor lights flicked on. The door swung open to reveal my father, Richard. He was wearing his expensive silk pajamas, a scowl etched deep into his features. Patricia stood right behind him, clutching her robe, looking highly inconvenienced by the intrusion. "Officer, what is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, his voice thick with the arrogance of a man who believed his bank account made him untouchable. "Do you have any idea what time it is? You are disturbing our property." The senior officer did not flinch. "Sir, we received a distress call from this address. We just found a young woman in your unheated garage, suffering from severe exposure and a laceration. She states you locked her out in the blizzard without shoes or winter clothing." Richard scoffed, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. "Oh, for heaven's sake! Is that what this is about? That is my daughter, Naomi. She was throwing a childish tantrum over cooking a meal. We simply put her outside for a few minutes to cool off. It was a family joke. A little tough love, that is all. Now, if you will excuse us, we are going back to sleep." He moved to shut the door, but the officer firmly planted his heavy boot against the frame. "Sir, step back out here right now. This is not a family joke. Your daughter has mild frostbite and a lacerated hand from breaking into your garage just to survive the freezing temperatures. In the state of Colorado, forcing a family member into sub-zero conditions is considered domestic violence and reckless endangerment." Patricia pushed past my father, her eyes wide with sudden panic. "You cannot be serious," she shrieked. "We are prominent members of this community. You cannot come to our home and accuse us of such nonsense. She is lying to you to get attention. She is just a line cook. She is mentally unstable." The officer reached for his radio, calling for a secondary unit. "Ma'am, we have the victim currently receiving medical attention on your property. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. You are both being placed under arrest." The color completely drained from Richard's face. The reality of the situation finally pierced his wealthy bubble. "You cannot arrest me," he bellowed, his voice cracking with sudden desperation. "Do you know who I am? I will have your badges by morning. I will sue this entire department." His threats meant absolutely nothing. The officers swiftly spun Richard around, snapping the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. Patricia began to wail, a shrill, hysterical sound that cut through the howling wind. As they were marched down the icy front steps toward the waiting police cruisers, the commotion began to draw an audience. The flashing lights and Patricia's screaming woke the neighbors. Several multimillionaires emerged onto their illuminated balconies and front porches, wrapping their designer robes tight as they watched the spectacle unfold. Richard and Patricia, the couple who cared about social status more than anything else in the world, were being paraded through the snow in handcuffs like common criminals. Their humiliation was absolute and entirely public. As they were being shoved into the back of the squad cars, Richard desperately looked back toward the house. "Trent," he shouted at the top of his lungs. "Trent, come down here and fix this. Call the lawyers. Tell them she is lying." I sat in the back of the ambulance, fully alert now, watching the second-floor window. The light in Trent's room was still on. He had definitely heard the sirens. He had definitely heard our father screaming his name. But the golden child, the brilliant tech startup founder, did absolutely nothing. He stayed locked in his bedroom, cowering under his expensive sheets, refusing to step outside and face the police. He abandoned his beloved parents the exact second it became inconvenient for him. An officer approached the back of the ambulance with a notepad. I gave a cold, precise statement. I recounted the argument over the midnight steak, Patricia throwing my keys and coat into the snow, the physical shove, and Trent watching the entire thing from his window. I did not embellish. I did not cry. I stated the facts with the clinical detachment of a woman who was already plotting her next 10 moves. The paramedic advised me to go to the hospital for my hand and the frostbite, but I refused. The bleeding had stopped, bandaged tightly with thick gauze, and the sensation was slowly returning to my toes. I did not want to waste time in an emergency room. I needed a warm bed and my laptop. I ordered a premium Uber Black from my phone, directing it to a luxury resort hotel in downtown Aspen. As the sleek black SUV pulled up to the driveway, I stepped out of the ambulance. I pulled my borrowed thermal blanket tight across my shoulders. I walked past the police cruisers where my parents sat, locked in the back seats, shivering and defeated. They glared at me through the rain-streaked glass, their eyes burning with pure hatred. I did not look away. I stared right back at them, my expression entirely void of sympathy, before slipping into the heated leather seat of the Uber. The car rolled down the mountain, leaving the wreckage of my family behind in the storm. The sun rose over the snow-capped peaks of Aspen, casting a blinding white glare through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my luxury suite. I sat at the mahogany dining table, sipping a hot espresso and eating a perfectly poached egg. My right hand was wrapped tightly in fresh white gauze, throbbing with a dull, persistent ache from the shattered garage glass. My feet, though no longer a terrifying shade of blue, felt raw and tender against the plush hotel slippers. But physically, I was recovering perfectly. Mentally, I was sharper than I had been in years. I opened my laptop and began sorting through my corporate emails, authorizing multi-million-dollar supply chain contracts for my culinary hospitality group. My parents believed I was a helpless line cook who would spend the morning crying in a cheap motel. They had severely underestimated my resources, my resilience, and my total lack of remorse. By 10 in the morning, my phone buzzed with an automated notification from the county jail system. Richard and Patricia had posted bail. Knowing their financial situation was largely built on smoke and mirrors, I assumed they had scrambled to find a local bail bondsman willing to accept their flashy but heavily mortgaged assets as collateral for their release. The fact that they were out of a holding cell did not bother me. I knew exactly how their minds worked. They were deeply narcissistic, obsessed with their public image, and absolutely terrified of the scandal that was about to hit their country club circle. They would not hide and reflect on their horrific actions. They would immediately go on the offensive. They would try to rewrite history, twist the narrative, and crush me before I could speak my truth. I took another sip of espresso, waiting for their next move. The sharp, authoritative knock at my hotel door came exactly 45 minutes later. I did not flinch. Did not. I calmly set down my coffee cup, smoothed the wrinkles from my silk lounge shirt, and walked across the plush carpet. Looking through the peephole, I saw a man in a beige trench coat holding a thick manila envelope. He was not hotel staff, he was a process server. I opened the door with a polite, unaffected smile. "Are you Naomi?" the man asked, glancing down at a clipboard with an air of complete boredom. "I am," I replied, extending my uninjured left hand. "You have been served," he stated flatly, slapping the heavy envelope into my palm before turning on his heel and marching down the carpeted hallway without another word. I closed the heavy wooden door, locked the deadbolt, and walked back to the dining table. I tore open the envelope and spread the legal documents across the smooth mahogany surface. The header of the first document made me let out a short, dry laugh. It was a civil lawsuit filed in the county court. Richard and Patricia were suing me for $100,000 for malicious destruction of private property. They were claiming that the small, decorative glass pane I had broken to access the garage and save my own life was a rare, custom-imported antique. They demanded exorbitant compensation for the repair, emotional distress, and the cost of the decorative stone planter I had used to smash the window. They were attempting to financially ruin me for the crime of refusing to freeze to death on their patio. But the civil suit was merely the opening act of their pathetic legal theater. Beneath the financial demands lay a second, far more insidious document. It was a petition for an emergency restraining order. I scanned the sworn affidavit attached to the petition, reading the completely fabricated narrative my parents had constructed with their high-priced defense attorney. According to Patricia's sworn statement, I had not been locked out in the snow at all. Instead, she claimed I had suffered a severe, violent psychotic break triggered by extreme jealousy of my successful brother Trent. The affidavit was a masterpiece of gaslighting. Patricia wrote that I had thrown a dangerous tantrum in the kitchen, wildly throwing kitchen knives and threatening the family. She claimed she had gently asked me to step outside to calm down, at which point I flew into a blind rage, smashed the garage window, and called the police in a state of sheer delusion. Richard backed up her claims with his own signed statement, adding that I had a long, undocumented history of mental instability and substance abuse. They were explicitly asking the judge to mandate a psychiatric evaluation for me, hoping to use a medical hold to discredit my testimony and cover up their domestic violence charges. They painted themselves as terrified, loving parents who were victimized by a deranged daughter. They wanted to paint me as a crazy, bitter culinary worker who hallucinated the entire event. They assumed I would panic. They assumed I would be terrified by the threat of a $100,000 judgment and the stigma of a restraining order. They expected me to call them, crying and begging for a settlement, offering to drop the criminal charges if they dropped their civil suit. It was a classic intimidation tactic used by wealthy bullies who believed the legal system was merely a weapon for those who could afford the retainer fees. They believed I was too poor and too uneducated to fight back against a prominent family with deep pockets. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the fraudulent documents. My parents had just committed perjury by signing those sworn affidavits under penalty of law. They had put their blatant lies on the official public record. They thought they were building an impenetrable fortress around their reputation, but in reality, they had just handed me the rope to hang them with. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my lead corporate attorney. The game had officially begun, and I was holding all the winning pieces. My lead corporate attorney answered on the second ring. I instructed him to check his secure email portal, where I had uploaded high-resolution scans of the frivolous lawsuit and the fabricated restraining order affidavit. I listened to the steady clicking of his keyboard as he read the documents. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. He informed me that my parents had handed us a golden ticket for a malicious prosecution and defamation countersuit. I told him to draft the response, but to hold off on filing it immediately. I wanted them to feel confident. I wanted them to overplay their hand. I instructed my legal team to start digging into Richard and Patricia's current financial holdings, pulling every public record, mortgage lien, and credit report available. I hung up the phone and walked over to the expansive hotel window, looking out at the snow falling over the resort town. My moment of quiet reflection was shattered by a sudden vibration against the mahogany dining table. My cell phone was lighting up like a frantic distress beacon. Text messages, missed call alerts, and social media notifications were flooding my lock screen in an endless stream. The sheer volume of incoming data caused the device to freeze momentarily. I picked up the phone and swiped to open my notifications. The names flashing across the screen belonged to my extended family members. Aunts, uncles, and cousins, who had not bothered to speak to me in years, were suddenly blowing up my phone with paragraphs of vitriol. I opened the family group chat. The messages were vicious and unhinged. My aunt accused me of being a jealous, bitter traitor trying to destroy the family name. A cousin told me I was a failure who deserved to be locked up in a psychiatric ward. Another relative commanded me to drop the fake police charges and apologize to my parents on my knees. They called me a parasitic line cook, a disgrace, and a liar. I did not reply to a single message. I did not block their numbers. I simply took a screenshot of every cruel, defamatory text and dropped them into a secure cloud folder for my legal team. I needed to understand what triggered this coordinated digital assault. I switched over to my social media apps, opening Facebook first. The answer was plastered right at the top of my feed, heavily boosted by the algorithm. Trent had gone live. I clicked on the video, turning up the volume. My brother was sitting in his plush home office back at the Aspen estate. He wore a tasteful gray cashmere sweater, looking every bit the weary, responsible tech founder. The lighting was perfectly calibrated to cast soft, sympathetic shadows across his face. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes glistening with carefully manufactured tears. It was an Oscar-worthy performance of a heartbroken, deeply concerned sibling. He began speaking in a trembling, emotional voice. He told his audience that he was recording this video with a heavy heart to address a tragic family crisis that had unfortunately spilled into the public eye. He claimed the holidays had been ruined by a devastating mental health episode involving his younger sister. Trent looked down, taking a shaky breath for dramatic effect, before spinning a web of absolute fiction. He told his followers that I suffered a severe psychotic break, violently attacked our elderly parents, and smashed my way through the family property in a drug-induced rage. He claimed Richard and Patricia were victims of my unprovoked violence and were forced to call the authorities for their own safety. I watched his performance with cold, analytical detachment. He was expertly twisting the narrative, projecting his own malicious behavior onto me. But the true genius of his manipulation became apparent when I opened LinkedIn. Trent had posted the exact same tearful video to his professional network. On LinkedIn, the context of the video shifted from a family plea to a calculated business maneuver. In the caption, Trent explicitly tagged several high-net-worth venture capitalists and potential investors for his failing tech startup. He wrote a lengthy, inspiring post about overcoming personal adversity, maintaining corporate leadership during family tragedies, and the heavy burden of supporting a mentally unstable sibling. He was using my fabricated mental breakdown to garner professional sympathy. He wanted his investors to look at him and see a brave, stoic CEO holding his family together through a crisis. He leveraged a domestic violence incident to manipulate wealthy businessmen into funding his sinking company. The comment section on LinkedIn was a nauseating display of corporate sycophancy. Industry professionals were praising his vulnerability, commending his leadership, and offering their unwavering financial support. People who had never met me were typing out paragraphs of sympathy for Trent, validating his lies and boosting his engagement metrics. He was monetizing my trauma. Trent thought he was a brilliant strategist. He thought he could crush a helpless chef under the weight of his digital influence. He completely failed to realize that everything you post on the internet becomes permanent, admissible evidence. I did not leave a furious comment. I did not post a video defending my honor. I simply screen recorded the entire broadcast from both platforms. I meticulously captured the captions, the list of tagged investors, the timestamp, and the location data. I archived the URL links and bundled the entire digital package into an encrypted file. I opened a new email to my corporate attorney. I attached the video files and the screenshots of the family group chat. I typed a concise sentence instructing him to add defamation to our growing list of counterclaims. Trent had publicly declared war on a woman he thought was a penniless cook, unaware that he had handed a multi-million-dollar CEO the exact weapon needed to dismantle his entire professional reputation. 2 days later, the pristine, glass-walled conference room of my Denver legal counsel provided the perfect sanctuary to orchestrate my retaliation. The corporate law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a towering downtown skyscraper, offering a sweeping, panoramic view of the snow-dusted Rocky Mountains. I sat at the head of a massive marble table, dressed in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, projecting the exact authority my family believed I lacked. Spread out before me were the printed dossiers my legal team had compiled over the past 48 hours. My lead attorney, a ruthless litigator named Harrison, was systematically walking me through the preliminary asset checks on my parents. The financial reality of Richard and Patricia was even more pathetic than I had anticipated. Their Aspen estate was heavily leveraged, and their liquid assets were draining at an alarming rate to fund Trent's supposedly booming tech startup. As Harrison detailed the countersuit for malicious prosecution, a soft knock interrupted our strategy session. My executive assistant Carmen stepped into the conference room. She looked slightly flustered, a rare occurrence for someone who managed my grueling daily schedule with absolute precision. Carmen apologized for the interruption and informed me that I had an unannounced visitor waiting in the reception area. She explained that the woman had bypassed standard security protocols by utilizing a private corporate elevator code, and she absolutely refused to leave without speaking to me directly. I asked Carmen for the visitor's name, expecting to hear that Patricia had somehow tracked me down to throw another hysterical tantrum. Instead, Carmen handed me a sleek, embossed business card. The minimalist black text read, "Jada Williams, Independent Forensic Auditor." I stared at the card, my pulse quickening just a fraction. Jada was my sister-in-law. She was 32 years old, a brilliant, fiercely independent African-American woman who had married Trent 3 years ago. From the very beginning, my parents had treated Jada with the same thinly veiled condescension they reserved for me. Patricia often made passive-aggressive remarks about Jada's demanding career, implying that a good wife should focus entirely on supporting Trent's entrepreneurial genius. Richard simply ignored her intellect, treating her as a decorative accessory to his golden child's public image. Throughout family gatherings, Jada and I had maintained a quiet, unspoken solidarity, exchanging knowing glances across the dinner table whenever Trent launched into one of his arrogant monologues. However, we had never explicitly discussed the toxic underbelly of the family. I had always assumed she was blindly loyal to her husband. I instructed Carmen to send her in. Harrison offered to step out, but I told him to stay seated. If Trent had sent his wife to negotiate a settlement or plead for mercy regarding the police charges, I wanted my legal counsel present to document every single word. The heavy glass door swung open, and Jada walked into the conference room. She did not look like a woman sent to beg on behalf of a disgraced husband. She looked like an executioner. Jada wore a stunning emerald green pantsuit that commanded immediate respect. Her posture was flawless, her expression completely unreadable. In her right hand, she carried a thick, overloaded leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to double as a weapon. She did not offer a polite smile or waste time with pleasantries. Jada walked straight to the opposite end of the marble table and set her briefcase down with a resounding thud. She looked at Harrison, assessing him with sharp, analytical eyes, and then looked directly at me. "I saw Trent's ridiculous video on LinkedIn this morning," Jada stated, her voice cool, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I also saw the lawsuit your parents filed against you. They actually believe they have backed you into a corner. They think you are hiding in a cheap motel, terrified of their legal threats." I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers. "And what do you think, Jada? Are you here to serve as Trent's messenger? Did he send you to convince his unstable sister to drop the domestic violence charges?" Jada let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a beautiful, deeply cynical sound that instantly shattered the tension in the room. She unclasped the locks on her leather briefcase. "I am not here for Trent," she replied, her tone turning deadly serious. "I am here for myself. And I am here for you. I have spent the last 3 years trapped inside that suffocating, narcissistic nightmare of a family. I watched how Patricia treated you. I watched how Richard enabled the abuse. And I watched my husband gleefully participate in your destruction while pretending to be a visionary leader. They thought I was just a quiet, obedient wife who would smile for their country club photos and look the other way." Jada reached into her briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavily tabbed folder. She slid it across the smooth marble table. It stopped mere inches from my hands. "They completely forgot what I do for a living," Jada continued, her eyes flashing with fierce intelligence. "I am an independent forensic auditor. I track missing funds, uncover corporate fraud, and expose financial lies for federal agencies. My entire career is built on finding the truth buried under piles of fabricated documents. When Trent started acting erratic, and your parents suddenly began complaining about liquidating their assets, I did not just ask him what was wrong. I audited his entire life. I have been quietly preparing to leave him for 6 months. I was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when they locked you out in the freezing snow, I knew the moment had arrived. I looked down at the thick folder, my heart pounding with anticipation. What is in this file, Jada?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metallic digital recorder. She placed it deliberately on top of the financial dossier. "I stood in the hallway that night," Jada said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I was awake when Trent came home drunk. I heard the argument. I heard your mother dragging you to the patio door." Jada tapped her manicured fingernail against the digital recorder. "I have the audio of your mother physically shoving you and locking you out in the blizzard. I have her screaming that servants sleep outside. This recording will instantly destroy their frivolous civil suit and guarantee a criminal conviction." She paused, letting the magnitude of her offering sink in. Then, she leaned over the table, a predatory smile forming on her lips. "But the audio is just a bonus. The folder you are looking at is the real prize. I have something much, much worse about Trent." I reached out and pulled the heavy folder across the cool marble. Harrison leaned in close, his predatory legal instincts fully activated. Jada did not wait for me to read through the hundreds of pages. She delivered the fatal blow with absolute precision. "Trent does not have a tech startup," she stated, her voice echoing in the quiet conference room. "His entire company is a meticulously constructed shell. There is no proprietary software. There is no revolutionary artificial intelligence algorithm. He has been leasing a premium office space downtown and hiring freelance developers overseas to build dummy interfaces just to maintain appearances. He has been running a glorified Ponzi scheme for the past 3 years." I opened the first tab in the folder. It was a dense spreadsheet cross-referencing multiple bank accounts, personal credit lines, and corporate ledgers. My eyes scanned the columns, registering the massive outbound transfers. Jada pointed to a specific sequence of highlighted numbers. "Your parents think they are funding the next Silicon Valley unicorn," she continued, leaning over the table. "Richard and Patricia have liquidated nearly 80% of their retirement portfolios. They mortgaged the Aspen estate to the absolute limit. They handed Trent complete control over their liquid assets because they believed his arrogant lies about exponential returns. Trent has been bleeding them dry, month after month, year after year. He manipulated their desperate need for status, convincing them that his fake success would elevate the family name." I flipped to the next section of the dossier. There were copies of wire transfers, vehicle registration documents, and luxury apartment lease agreements. "But the money is not going into research and development," Jada said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "It is going straight into his personal slush fund, My brilliant visionary husband has been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to a 22-year-old fitness influencer in Miami. I spent weeks auditing his encrypted laptop while he slept off his hangovers. I found the lease agreement for her luxury beachfront condo. I found the wire transfers paying off her private student loans. I found the purchase orders for 2 brand new sports cars registered entirely in her name to hide the assets from me and from the Internal Revenue Service. Trent took your parents' life savings and handed it to his mistress. He bought his way into a fantasy life while lecturing you about hard work and responsibility. Harrison let out a low whistle, running a hand over his jaw. This is textbook wire fraud, he noted. If he is soliciting investments across state lines using fabricated financial projections, we are looking at severe federal charges. Jada nodded sharply. Exactly. He has been soliciting money from members of your parents' country club, promising them ground floor equity in a company that literally does not exist. He faked user acquisition metrics. He forged revenue reports. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI will have a field day with this file. He is looking at decades in federal prison. I sat back in my leather chair, letting the sheer magnitude of Trent's deception wash over me. My parents had cast me out into the brutal snow, calling me a failure and a parasite, all while their beloved golden child was actively bankrupting them. They were completely broke, standing on the very edge of total financial ruin, and they were entirely oblivious. Their precious social status, their arrogant country club persona, the Aspen estate, it was all built on a foundation of sand that was rapidly washing away into the ocean. Jada looked at me, her expression resolute and unyielding. I am filing for divorce, she stated. But I am not just walking away quietly. I am taking my half of the legitimate marital assets, and I am submitting this entire dossier to federal authorities. I wanted to bring this to you first because I saw what they did to you the other night. I saw the absolute cruelty in their eyes when they locked you out. I want to coordinate our strikes. I want to make sure that when this family goes down, they go down for everything they have done to both of us. The symmetry of our situation was profound. We were the 2 women this family had chronically underestimated. We were the ones they mocked, dismissed, and treated as background characters in their delusion of grandeur. And now, sitting in this high-rise law office, we held the absolute power to dismantle their entire world. I looked at Jada, feeling a deep, genuine respect for the woman sitting across from me. She had played the role of the quiet, supportive wife flawlessly, while meticulously gathering the hard evidence needed to secure her own freedom and exact her revenge. It was time to show her exactly who she was allying with. Jada, I began, keeping my voice perfectly level. You have handed me the key to destroying Trent, but there is something you need to know about me, something Richard, Patricia, and Trent have absolutely no idea about. I closed the financial dossier and folded my hands on the table, holding her gaze. I am not a line cook, I said clearly. I do not just chop vegetables and scrub pots for a living. I am the founder and chief executive officer of a bespoke culinary and hospitality group. My company provides exclusive high-end dining experiences, private estate management, and luxury event coordination for ultra-high net worth individuals across the globe. My corporate valuation passed $50 million last quarter, and we are currently expanding into international markets. Jada blinked, her composed facade cracking for the very first time. She stared at me in stunned silence as I continued to dismantle the lie I had fed my family for a decade. I am also an aggressive real estate investor, I explained, my tone strictly business. I use corporate holding companies and blind trusts to acquire commercial properties and luxury residential estates. I let my family believe I was a struggling, low-income worker because it was the easiest way to avoid their toxic financial demands. If they knew I had money, Patricia would have demanded I fund Trent's fraudulent startup years ago. I chose peace over pride. I chose to build my empire in the shadows so they could never touch it. Harrison slid a single heavy stock sheet of paper across the table to Jada. It was a verified summary of my corporate holdings and real estate portfolio. Jada picked it up and scanned the document, her eyes widening as she processed the sheer scale of my actual wealth. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face, transforming her entire demeanor. "You are a multimillionaire," she whispered, almost laughing at the breathtaking absurdity of my parents' arrogant ignorance. "They locked a $50 million CEO out in the snow because they thought you were a helpless peasant." "They dug their own graves," I replied, matching her triumphant smile. "And with the information you just brought me, Jada, we are going to bury them." Harrison turned back to the conference table, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. With Jada providing the exact account numbers and routing codes Trent had been using, my legal team had a direct map to my parents' hidden financial reality. Within 20 minutes, Harrison projected a series of banking documents onto the large screen at the end of the room. It was not just Trent who was running a scam. Richard and Patricia had been living a lie for nearly a decade. Harrison pointed to a specific document detailing the ownership structure of the Aspen estate. My father had always boasted to his wealthy friends that he bought the multi-million-dollar property in cash. That was a complete fabrication. He had taken out a massive secondary mortgage on the estate 3 years ago. The loan was explicitly structured to extract maximum equity, essentially turning their winter home into a giant automated teller machine. "And where did that cash go?" Jada asked rhetorically, tapping her manicured nails against the marble table. "It went straight into Trent's fraudulent startup to maintain the illusion of rapid venture capital growth. Richard practically handed the bank the keys to his own home just so his golden child could buy sports cars for a fitness influencer. The situation was even worse than just a bad mortgage." Harrison pulled up a formal notice of default issued by the lender. Richard had not made a single payment on the secondary mortgage in over 4 months. The bank had already initiated the pre-foreclosure process. They were legally drowning. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the designer clothes Patricia flaunted, all of it was financed by high-interest credit and loans they could no longer service. The walls were rapidly closing in on them. "They locked me out in the freezing snow because I refused to cook a steak," I said, my voice cold and analytical as I stared at the projected documents. "But they are literal weeks away from being thrown out into the snow themselves by an angry bank." Harrison nodded, pulling up the lender's portfolio details. "The debt is currently classified as highly distressed," he explained. "The bank knows Richard is a high-risk borrower. They are likely looking to offload the toxic asset to a third-party debt buyer at a steep discount just to wipe it from their books entirely." I leaned forward, my mind rapidly calculating the legal and financial angles. The symmetry of the situation was too perfect to ignore. I looked at Harrison with absolute clarity. "Buy it," I commanded. Harrison paused, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "Excuse me?" "I want you to initiate contact with the commercial lender immediately," I instructed, my voice unwavering. "Use one of my blind corporate holding entities. The Culinary Group has a subsidiary limited liability company, registered in Delaware, that we use for acquiring distressed commercial restaurant properties. Use that entity to purchase Richard's secondary mortgage from the bank. Offer them a cash buyout for the toxic debt. I want that loan transferred to my corporate portfolio by the end of the business day." Jada let out a sharp gasp, her eyes wide with sudden, brilliant comprehension. "You are going to buy their debt?" she whispered, the realization washing over her face. Harrison smiled, a ruthless, predatory grin that promised absolute destruction. "If we acquire the note," he explained to Jada, "we assume all the rights of the original lender. We become the primary lien holder on the Aspen estate. Because the loan is already in default, we have the legal authority to accelerate the foreclosure process without any further warnings." I met Jada's gaze, feeling a profound sense of power settling into my bones. "I am not just going to be their daughter anymore," I said quietly. I am going to be their legal creditor. I am going to own the very ground they stand on, and they will not have the slightest idea until the trap snaps shut. Harrison immediately picked up his phone and began mobilizing the firm's real estate acquisition team. The process of buying distressed debt through a corporate entity was entirely legal, highly efficient, and absolutely devastating to the debtor. As Harrison stepped out into the hallway to execute the financial maneuver, my personal cell phone buzzed on the marble table. I glanced at the glowing screen. It was Richard. I stared at the caller identification, feeling a surge of profound irony. The man who is currently trying to sue me for $100,000, the man whose defaulted mortgage I was currently purchasing, was calling me on a Tuesday afternoon. I signaled for Jada to remain quiet and answered the call on speakerphone. "Hello, Richard," I answered, my tone perfectly flat. There was a loud, exasperated sigh on the other end of the line. "Naomi," my father began, employing his best authoritative, condescending tone. "I am calling to offer you a way out of the massive legal trouble you have caused for yourself. Your mother and I are furious about the broken window and your little stunt with the police, but we are willing to be reasonable." I kept my voice entirely neutral, betraying none of the amusement I felt. "How generous of you! What exactly is your offer?" Richard cleared his throat, sounding incredibly self-important. "Trent has secured a meeting with a major billionaire investor this weekend. This man is flying in to evaluate the startup, and Trent needs to impress him. We are hosting a highly exclusive private dinner party at the Aspen house. Your mother and I are willing to drop our lawsuit and the restraining order against you on one condition. You will come back to the house, use the servant entrance, and cater this dinner free of charge. You will cook a flawless 5-course meal, serve the guests silently, and leave immediately after. If you do this to help your brother secure his funding, we will pretend your little mental breakdown never happened." I looked across the table at Jada. She covered her mouth with her hand, silently shaking with laughter at the sheer audacity of the demand. My parents were completely bankrupt, facing federal fraud exposure and secretly owned by me, yet they were still trying to treat me like the help. "I will do it," I replied softly, ensuring my voice sounded suitably defeated. "I will cater your dinner party." I hung up the phone, a cold smile spreading across my face. The trap was firmly and perfectly set for them. The moment the call disconnected, I placed my phone face down on the marble table. Jada let out a breath she had been holding, her eyes shining with a mix of disbelief and sheer exhilaration. We did not need to say a word to each other. We both understood that my father had just handed us the perfect stage for their execution. My parents thought they were cleverly exploiting my supposed desperation. They thought the threat of a frivolous $100,000 lawsuit had successfully broken my spirit. In reality, they had just invited the architect of their destruction right through their front door. Within 10 minutes, my phone vibrated again. The screen lit up with a notification from my personal email. The sender was Patricia. I opened the message, projecting it onto the large conference room screen so Jada and my attorney, Harrison, could read it. The subject line was written entirely in capital letters, demanding strict compliance. My mother had wasted absolutely no time drafting a comprehensive, humiliating list of rules for my upcoming catering performance. The email was a masterpiece of condescension. Patricia dictated that I was to arrive at the Aspen estate no later than noon on Saturday to begin prep work, but I was strictly forbidden from using the main driveway. She ordered me to park my car in the staff overflow lot down the mountain and walk up the service path. I was to enter only through the mudroom. I was instructed to wear a plain black uniform with no jewelry, no makeup, and my hair tied back in a tight, invisible bun. Under a bold, underlined section titled Guest Interaction, Patricia explicitly forbade me from making eye contact with their billionaire investor. I was to serve the food silently from the left, clear the plates from the right, and remain entirely out of sight in the kitchen whenever I was not actively serving. Jada scoffed loudly as she read the menu requirements. Trent had demanded an absurdly complex 5-course tasting menu. He wanted butter-poached lobster tail, a Wagyu beef Wellington with a perfectly crisp pastry shell, truffle-infused wild mushroom risotto, and a highly technical spun sugar dessert that required hours of meticulous preparation. At the very bottom of the long email, Patricia added a final, vicious stipulation. She stated that since I was working off my legal debt to the family, I would be required to purchase all the premium ingredients out of my own pocket. They expected a woman they believed was a broke, unemployed line cook to finance thousands of dollars worth of luxury ingredients just for the privilege of avoiding a fake lawsuit. I forwarded the email to my executive assistant, Carmen. I typed a quick note instructing her to source the absolute best ingredients available in the state of Colorado. I wanted this meal to be flawless. I wanted the billionaire investor to taste absolute culinary perfection before the entire illusion shattered around my family. My phone rang again. This time it was a direct call from Patricia. I answered, putting her on speakerphone so Jada could hear every word. Naomi, my mother barked, bypassing any form of greeting. I assume you read my email. I expect total perfection this weekend. Trent has worked incredibly hard to secure this meeting, and this investor is vital to his startup. Do not mess this up like you messed up college. I kept my voice small, injecting just the right amount of manufactured shame into my tone. I did not mess up college, Mom. I had to drop out because I could not afford the tuition after you emptied my account. Patricia let out a harsh, dismissive sigh. Oh, stop playing the victim. We have been over this a million times. You know perfectly well why I had you sign over your college tuition fund to your brother. Trent was launching his first business venture. He is a man, Naomi. Men need the financial backing more. They carry the heavy burden of building a legacy and supporting a family. You were just taking art and hospitality classes. You did not need $100,000 sitting in a trust fund just to learn how to bake bread. Your brother needed that capital to network and grow. I glanced at Jada. Her jaw was clenched tight, her eyes burning with fierce outrage on my behalf. My mother was casually admitting to deep financial abuse, proudly confirming that she had forced an 18-year-old girl to sign away her entire educational future just to fund Trent's early, failed attempts at playing a brilliant businessman. I gave the money to Trent because he is an innovator, Patricia continued, her voice dripping with maternal pride for her golden child. And look at him now. He is on the verge of a $10 million venture capital deal. If you had kept that money, you would still just be a nobody in a dirty kitchen. At least this way, your fund contributed to the family empire. So you will show up on Saturday, you will keep your mouth shut, and you will do your job. If you embarrass us in front of Mr. Harrison, we will not just sue you for the window, we will make sure you never work in this state again. Am I understood? Yes, Mom, I replied, my voice perfectly submissive. I understand completely. I will be there on Saturday. Patricia hung up the phone without another word. The line went dead. I looked at the blank screen, feeling a deep, profound sense of calm washing over me. Patricia had just threatened to ruin my career, completely unaware that she was speaking to the chief executive officer of a $50 million hospitality group. She bragged about stealing my college fund to finance a brother who was actively bankrupting them to pay for his mistress. Jada was already packing her forensic accounting documents back into her leather briefcase, her expression mirroring my own ruthless determination. We had our timeline, we had our venue, we had our audience. My parents wanted a silent servant to cater their fraudulent dinner party. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, and I was going to serve it with a side of absolute destruction. I turned back to my laptop as Jada left the conference room to finalize her divorce filings. My executive assistant, Carmen, forwarded me a secondary email from Trent. He sent me a highly detailed, condescending schedule for the Saturday dinner, along with the specific dietary requirements of his prized investor. I opened the attached document, scanning past Trent's arrogant instructions about how I needed to stay invisible. My eyes landed on the profile Trent compiled. He wanted me to memorize the investor's preferences to ensure absolute perfection. It listed a preference for vintage Bordeaux, an allergy to shellfish, and a fondness for European truffles. But it was the name printed boldly at the top of the dossier that made my breath catch in my throat. Mr. Elias Harrison. I stared at the glowing screen for a minute, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. The sheer, unadulterated irony of the universe was magnificent. Trent had spent months chasing this specific billionaire, desperate to secure a $10 million injection for his fabricated tech startup. He viewed Elias Harrison as his ultimate savior, the man who would validate his entire fraudulent existence and replenish the family coffers. My brother had no idea he was begging for money from my business partner. Elias Harrison was not a random venture capitalist. He was one of the most prominent commercial real estate developers in the country and a vital client of my culinary hospitality group. For the past 4 years, my company had exclusively catered every single one of his private corporate galas, charity fundraisers, and board meetings. We had built a relationship founded on absolute trust and mutual respect. But our connection went far deeper than luxury catering. Just 3 weeks ago, Elias had launched a massive, highly exclusive commercial real estate fund aimed at acquiring distressed luxury properties across the Mountain West. He needed a lead investor, a quiet, heavy-hitting underwriter who could provide the anchor capital without demanding public recognition. I was that lead investor. I had committed $20 million from my private holding company to back his new fund. We were currently closing a deal that dwarfed Trent's pathetic, fraudulent startup by astronomical margins. My parents had commanded me to silently serve a man whose entire new real estate portfolio relied on my direct financial approval. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Elias Harrison's private, direct line. He answered on the second ring, his booming, jovial voice filling the quiet conference room. "Naomi, my favorite visionary. Tell me you are calling to confirm the final wire transfer for the Denver acquisition." I laughed softly, feeling the adrenaline pumping through my veins. "The transfer is cleared, Elias, but I am actually calling you about a personal matter. I understand you are flying into Aspen this weekend to evaluate a tech startup." Elias paused, surprised by my knowledge of his schedule. "I am. It is a small seed round pitch. Some local guy named Trent. He has been hounding my acquisitions team for 6 months, making wild claims about revolutionary artificial intelligence. I agreed to a dinner meeting just to get him off my desk." "Why do you ask? Do you know him?" I took a deep breath, savoring the moment. "Trent is my older brother, Elias, and the house you are having dinner at belongs to my parents." The line went dead silent for a moment. Then, Elias let out a sharp whistle. "I had no idea." "Well, that completely changes things. If he is your brother, I will certainly give his pitch a more favorable look." "No," I corrected him immediately, my tone turning deadly serious. "I am calling to warn you. Do not give him a single cent." I proceeded to tell Elias the entire truth. I laid out the meticulous forensic audit Jada had uncovered. I explained that Trent's company was a hollow shell, a Ponzi scheme designed to funnel retirement funds to his mistress. I told him about the forged financial projections, the fake overseas developers, and the fact that my parents were currently facing foreclosure because they had leveraged their entire Aspen estate to fund his lies. I did not stop there. I told Elias exactly how my family treated me. I described the domestic violence incident in the blizzard, the frivolous lawsuit they had filed against me, and the humiliating list of demands my mother had just emailed me, commanding me to act as their silent servant for his dinner. Elias listened without interrupting. When I finished, the jovial warmth was entirely gone from his voice, replaced by cold, calculated fury. He was a man who despised fraud and valued loyalty above all else. "This is abhorrent, Naomi. I will cancel the meeting right now. I will have my legal team flag his company for the federal authorities immediately." I smiled, looking out at the snow-covered mountains. "No, Elias, do not cancel the meeting," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "I want you to attend that dinner. I am going to follow my mother's instructions perfectly. I am going to wear the cheap uniform, enter through the mudroom, and serve you your meals in total silence. I want Trent to give you his entire fraudulent presentation. I want him to believe he has you completely hooked. And then, right when he asks you to sign the term sheet, I want you to tell him the truth." I explained my strategy in precise detail, outlining the exact sequence of events that would maximize their public humiliation and completely dismantle their false reality. Elias let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed through the phone speaker. It was a dark, appreciative sound. "You are a truly terrifying woman, Naomi," he said, his tone thick with admiration. "I love it. I will play the eager investor to absolute perfection. We will let your brother dig his own grave, and we will bury him in it together." I thanked Elias, confirming our timeline for Saturday night. I disconnected the call and closed my laptop, a sense of profound serenity washing over my spirit. My family thought they had orchestrated my ultimate degradation. Instead, they had built the very stage where I would execute their complete financial and social annihilation right now. The countdown to Saturday night had officially begun, and I was going to ensure their absolute, complete, and utter ruin was served to them on a silver platter. I parked in the gravel overflow lot, strictly adhering to the humiliating instructions Patricia had emailed me. I stepped into the freezing air wearing the exact outfit she mandated. A plain black uniform, rubber-soled shoes, and no makeup, my hair in a tight bun. I grabbed the insulated catering bags and began the steep trek up the service path. The biting wind whipped my face, a reminder of the night they locked me out. Today, the cold fueled me. I punched the service code and stepped into the gleaming kitchen. I unpacked the premium ingredients my assistant had procured: massive lobster tails, a 5 Wagyu beef, and fresh European black truffles. I had spared no expense, using corporate funds to secure the exact vintage Bordeaux Elias preferred, knowing it would eventually be billed to Richard's bankruptcy. I worked with the ruthless efficiency of a seasoned culinary executive. Every cut was precise, every temperature calibrated. I assembled a culinary masterpiece in the room where I had been degraded days prior. Soon, the kitchen was humming with simmering reductions and searing meats. The heavy swinging door pushed open, and Patricia marched in. She wore an emerald green evening gown that clung tightly to her frame, her neck adorned with a heavy diamond necklace that I knew was financed by the very secondary mortgage I now owned. She stopped a few feet away from the island, crossing her arms as she inspected my work. She did not greet me. She simply pointed a manicured finger at a stack of polishing cloths. "Polish the silver twice," Patricia commanded, her voice sharp and anxious. "Mr. Harrison is a man of exceptional taste. He is accustomed to absolute perfection, and I will not have you ruining this evening with water spots on the silverware. Keep your head down, do not speak unless spoken to, and remember that you are entirely invisible tonight." I nodded subserviently, keeping my eyes fixed on the cutting board. "Yes, Mom, I will be completely invisible." She let out a dramatic huff of disapproval, adjusting her necklace before turning on her heel and marching back into the formal dining room to arrange the centerpieces. I returned my focus to the appetizers. I had prepared a delicate array of truffle-infused wild mushroom arancini, plating them meticulously on a heavy silver tray. The swinging door burst open again. Trent swaggered into the kitchen. He was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that looked brand new, practically radiating a sickening mix of cheap cologne and unearned arrogance. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch in his right hand, swirling the amber liquid as he surveyed the kitchen. He looked at me in my drab black uniform and let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Look at you," Trent sneered, taking a slow sip of his drink. "You actually showed up. I guess the threat of $100,000 lawsuit finally taught you how to follow orders. It is good to see you wearing the uniform you were born for." I did not engage with his childish taunts. I picked up the heavy silver tray of carefully arranged appetizers and turned to carry them toward the staging counter. Trent saw his opportunity. As I stepped past the central island, he deliberately lunged forward, slamming his shoulder violently against mine. The impact threw me off balance. The heavy silver tray slipped from my grasp, crashing onto the hard marble floor with a deafening clatter. Dozens of perfectly crafted arancini scattered across the tiles, ruined in an instant. Trent stood over the mess, looking down at the ruined food with a look of pure, malicious joy radiating from his eyes. He took another leisurely sip of his scotch. "Clean it up, servant," he laughed loudly, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "And you better make a fresh batch immediately before the doorbell rings. Tonight, I am securing $10 million from Elias Harrison, and I will not let a clumsy line cook derail my valuation." Trent stepped over the ruined appetizers, intentionally crushing one beneath the heel of his expensive Italian leather shoe, and sauntered out of the kitchen, leaving the door swinging in his wake. I stood in the center of the kitchen, looking down at the crushed food and the smeared truffle oil on the pristine marble floor. I did not feel a single flash of anger. I did not feel humiliated. I felt an overwhelming wave of absolute terrifying calm. I knelt down on the cold floor and quietly began gathering the ruined appetizers, wiping the marble completely clean with a fresh white cloth. As I wiped the marble, I thought about the heavy folder sitting in my lawyer's briefcase, the foreclosure notice, the wire fraud evidence Jada had compiled. Every second that ticked by brought Trent closer to a cold federal prison cell. I tossed the destroyed food into the trash bin and immediately began rolling a fresh batch of arancini. My hands moved with mechanical precision. I pulled back the sleeve of my cheap black uniform and checked the face of my watch. It was 6:45 in the evening. Elias Harrison was scheduled to arrive at exactly 7 o'clock. My brother thought he had just asserted his dominance over a helpless, indebted culinary worker. He firmly believed he was 15 minutes away from securing a massive fortune to fund his fraudulent lifestyle and his young mistress in Miami. I plated the new batch of appetizers, setting them gently on a freshly polished silver tray. I checked my reflection in the dark glass of the commercial oven. I looked exactly like the obedient, beaten-down servant my family demanded. I smoothed my apron, picked up a pristine white towel, and waited for the doorbell to ring. The countdown was officially over. I stood completely still in the center of the kitchen, listening closely as the heavy oak front door chimed. The final performance of their fraudulent lives was finally beginning. The heavy oak front door chimed a second time, sending a frantic jolt of electricity through the house. I stood perfectly still behind the swinging kitchen door, peering through the narrow gap between the hinges. My father, Richard, practically tripped over the expensive Persian rug in his haste to reach the foyer. Trent was right on his heels, frantically smoothing his lapels and checking his reflection in the antique mirror hanging in the hallway. They looked exactly like starving dogs desperate for a scrap of meat. Richard swung the massive door open, letting in a gust of freezing mountain air. Standing on the threshold was Elias Harrison. He wore a tailored cashmere overcoat that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, exuding an aura of absolute terrifying power. He did not look like a man arriving for a friendly dinner. He looked like an apex predator stepping into a cage full of very small, very fragile prey. "Mr. Harrison," Richard gasped, his voice pitching up an octave in his sheer desperation to please. "Welcome to our humble home. It is an absolute honor to host you this evening. Please, come in out of the cold. Let me take your coat." Trent pushed past our father, extending his hand with a painfully eager smile. "Elias, it is fantastic to see you. Thank you so much for making the trip up the mountain. I have the entire pitch deck ready in the study, and I assure you the numbers are going to blow you away." I watched Elias step into the grand foyer. He did not immediately shake Trent's hand. He let my brother stand there for 5 agonizing seconds, his hands suspended in the air, before finally offering a brief, firm handshake. Elias was playing his part beautifully. He knew exactly how to establish dominance in a room, and he was making Trent sweat before the evening had even begun. "Thank you for the invitation," Elias said, his booming voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am looking forward to seeing what you have to offer, Trent." though I prefer to keep business discussions until after the first course. I find desperation ruins my appetite. Trent swallowed hard, the color draining from his face at the subtle insult. But he quickly recovered, letting out a loud, artificial laugh. Of course, absolutely. Business after the food. My father laughed along with him, bobbing his head in enthusiastic agreement. Richard reached out, practically begging to take Elias's coat and gloves. It was pathetic to witness. The man who had confidently locked his own daughter out in a blizzard was now bowing and scraping, eager to play the servant to a billionaire. They ushered Elias into the main living room, leading him toward the massive stone fireplace where the flames roared behind the glass screen. As the men settled into the plush leather armchairs, the kitchen door suddenly flew open, hitting the wall with a loud thud. Patricia rushed in, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a manic, frantic energy. She smoothed her emerald green evening gown, her diamond necklace catching the harsh kitchen lights. She marched directly over to my prep station, grabbing my shoulder and jerking me away from the cutting board. "He is here," Patricia hissed, her voice a frantic whisper. "Bring out the vintage Bordeaux immediately. And do not make a sound. Do not drop anything. Do not look at him." She stepped back, her eyes raking over my plain black uniform and my tightly pulled back hair. She let out a sharp, disgusted sigh. "Look at you. You look entirely pathetic. But I suppose that works in our favor. It shows we have the resources to keep the help in line. Pour the wine, clear the space, and get out of his sight." I did not argue. I kept my face entirely blank, masking the profound satisfaction bubbling in my chest. "Yes, Mom," I said softly. Patricia snapped her fingers an inch from my face. "Do not call me Mom out there. Tonight, I am Mrs. Anderson to you." She turned and hurried back out to the living room to join the men. I picked up the heavy silver tray, placing the expensive bottle of vintage Bordeaux and 4 crystal glasses on the polished surface. The bottle alone cost more than Trent had generated in legitimate revenue all year. I balanced the tray perfectly, keeping my posture subservient, my shoulders rounded, playing the role of the defeated culinary worker to absolute perfection. I pushed through the swinging door and stepped into the grand living area. The room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of the fire. Elias sat in the center armchair, looking utterly relaxed, while Richard and Trent perched nervously on the edges of the matching sofa. Trent was sweating profusely. He was talking a mile a minute, rambling about market trends and artificial intelligence algorithms, throwing out meaningless corporate buzzwords to sound intelligent. Elias simply nodded, nursing a glass of sparkling water, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room. I walked silently across the expensive rug, my rubber-soled shoes making absolutely no noise. I approached the heavy oak coffee table situated between the armchairs. As I lowered the silver tray toward the table, Patricia noticed my arrival. She sat in a high-backed chair next to Elias, holding a small clutch purse in her lap. She saw an opportunity to elevate her own status by publicly degrading mine. It was her favorite party trick. Patricia let out a loud, theatrical sigh, making sure Elias turned his attention toward her. She snapped her fingers sharply, pointing at the exact spot on the table where she wanted the tray placed. "Forgive my daughter," Patricia said to Mr. Harrison, her voice projecting clearly across the quiet room. She ensured every single syllable dripped with condescension. "She is a bit slow, I am afraid. We let her help out around the house because she really cannot manage much else. She is only good for manual labor." I kept my head bowed, my eyes fixed firmly on the silver tray as I arranged the crystal glasses. I did not flinch. I did not react to the insult. I poured the dark, rich red wine into the glasses with absolute precision, my hands perfectly steady. Trent chuckled nervously at Patricia's comment, eager to agree with whatever narrative his mother was spinning. "Yes," he added, leaning toward Elias with a conspiratorial smirk. "We try to keep her busy in the kitchen. It keeps her out of trouble. You know how it is, Elias. Every family has that one relative who just cannot quite figure out how the real world works. We do our best to support her, but it is a heavy burden. Richard nodded solemnly, picking up his glass of wine. It teaches patience, he declared, taking a sip of the Bordeaux I had just poured. We provide the roof, the food, the stability. It is the least we can do. But enough about family obligations. Let us talk about the future, Elias. Let us talk about what my brilliant son here is building. Patricia smiled brightly, waving her hand at me as if swatting away a stray dog. You may go now, she commanded sharply. Return to the kitchen and wait until we are ready for the appetizers. And do not dawdle. I picked up the empty silver tray, clutching it tightly against my plain black uniform. I did not turn around immediately. I stood by the coffee table, letting the crushing weight of their arrogant lies settle over the room. They had just painted themselves as charitable, long-suffering saints burdening themselves with a mentally deficient failure. They had fed this entire fiction to a billionaire, completely convinced that their wealth and status made their lies impenetrable. They believed their performance was flawless. They believed they had the entire room firmly under their control. But as I finally lifted my gaze from the polished oak table, I saw Elias staring directly at me. The jovial, relaxed demeanor he had brought into the house was entirely gone. His jaw was clenched, his eyes narrowed into dark, dangerous slits as he looked from Patricia to Trent, and finally to Richard. The trap had been baited, set, and loaded with the heaviest ammunition possible. All that remained was for the predator to snap the jaws shut. The heavy silence in the living room stretched for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the crackling of the logs in the massive stone fireplace and the faint clink of the crystal wine glass my father had just set down. Patricia noticed the sudden, severe change in Elias Harrison's expression. However, her inherent narcissism blinded her to the actual reality of the situation. She immediately assumed his darkened mood was my fault. She assumed my mere presence in my cheap black uniform had somehow offended the billionaire's delicate sensibilities. Patricia shot me a venomous glare, her acrylic nails digging into the leather arm of her chair. I told you to return to the kitchen, she hissed, dropping the polite hostess facade entirely. Leave the tray and get out of our sight right now. You are hovering and it is completely inappropriate. Trent jumped in, eager to align himself with his mother and appease the man he viewed as his financial savior. I apologize for her, Elias, Trent said, his voice dripping with nervous desperation. I will have security escort her out if she cannot follow basic instructions. We just try to give her simple tasks, but clearly even that is too much to ask. Elias did not look at Trent. He did not acknowledge my mother. His piercing gaze remained fixed entirely on me. Slowly, deliberately, Elias stood up from the plush leather armchair. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and imposing, radiating the kind of raw authority that could not be faked or purchased. The easygoing smile he had worn since walking through the front door was completely eradicated. As he drew himself up to his full height, the dynamic in the room shifted so violently that the air actually felt heavy. Richard instinctively shrank back against the sofa cushions. Trent swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat as he scrambled to stand up as well, mistakenly believing Elias was preparing to walk out on the pitch meeting. Elias raised his right hand, extending a single, commanding finger toward my brother. Do not speak another word, Elias ordered. His voice was not loud, but it carried a lethal, freezing edge that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Trent snapped his mouth shut so fast his teeth audibly clicked. Elias bypassed Trent completely, stepping around the heavy oak coffee table. He walked directly toward me, ignoring the expensive vintage Bordeaux I had just poured. Patricia gasped, likely terrified that the billionaire was about to personally reprimand her deficient daughter. Instead, Elias stopped right in front of me. The lethal coldness in his eyes vanished the second he looked into mine, replaced by a deep, genuine warmth and profound professional respect. He reached out, took the heavy silver tray from my hands, and placed it carelessly onto a side table. Then, in front of my horrified family, Elias Harrison opened his arms and pulled me into a firm, friendly embrace. "Naomi!" he boomed, his voice echoing with genuine delight. "What an absolute surprise. I had no idea you would be here personally. Are you doing quality control on your catering staff tonight?" The reaction was instantaneous and entirely devastating. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless squeak, her hand flying to her throat as if she were actively choking, her jaw unhinged, hanging completely slack. Richard fumbled his wine glass. The fragile crystal slipped through his trembling fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor and sending dark red wine splashing across the expensive Persian rug. He did not even look down at the mess. He was paralyzed, his eyes bulging out of his head as he stared at the billionaire hugging the daughter he had locked out in the freezing snow. Trent looked like he had just been struck by a high-voltage electrical current. His brain entirely short-circuited. He stood frozen next to the sofa, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, struggling to comprehend the impossible image unfolding in front of him. I stepped back from the embrace, allowing a bright, confident smile to finally break across my face. I completely dropped the submissive, hunched posture I had been maintaining all evening. I stood tall, meeting Elias as a direct peer. "It is wonderful to see you, Elias," I replied, my voice projecting clear and strong across the room. "I wanted to personally oversee the menu this evening. When I saw your name on the guest list, I knew I had to ensure the hospitality was up to our usual corporate standards. You know I never leave our premium accounts to chance." Elias let out a rich, booming laugh that seemed to physically strike my father and brother. "Absolutely incredible," Elias said, shaking his head in admiration. "The relentless dedication of a $50 million chief executive officer. You never cease to amaze me, Naomi. This is exactly why my firm trusts your hospitality group exclusively, and frankly, this is exactly why I desperately wanted you as the lead investor for my new commercial real estate fund. Your attention to detail is completely unmatched." If the initial hug had paralyzed my family, the words $50 million CEO and lead investor acted as a fatal execution. Trent physically staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of the sofa. He collapsed onto the cushions, his face draining to a sickly, pale white. Patricia gripped the arms of her chair so tightly, her knuckles turned entirely translucent. Richard let out a bizarre, wheezing gasp, his chest heaving as he stared at me. The plain, black uniform, the rubber-soled shoes, the pulled-back hair. It all suddenly took on a terrifying new context for them. They had not been insulting a helpless, broken-line cook. They had been commanding, mocking, and degrading an ultra-high net worth executive who held their entire financial future in the palm of her hand. For decades, I had been the scapegoat. I had been the punching bag for Patricia's vanity and Richard's arrogance. I had watched Trent receive endless praise and unlimited funding for simply existing. They had spent their entire lives building a massive, delusional monument to their own superiority. And it took exactly 2 minutes of Elias Harrison speaking the absolute truth to burn their monument straight to the ground. Elias turned his attention back to my father and brother. The warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated disgust. "You know, Richard," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone, "I came here tonight expecting to hear a standard tech pitch from a hungry entrepreneur. I did not expect to sit in this room and listen to you and your son openly mock and humiliate my most valuable business partner." Trent scrambled to speak, his voice cracking in sheer panic. "Elias, please, you do not understand. There is a huge misunderstanding here. Naomi is just my sister. She has a little cooking business. We were just joking around. It is family banter." "A little cooking business," Elias repeated, tasting the words with absolute revulsion. He looked at Trent as if he were an insect crawling across the floor. "Your sister runs an international luxury hospitality empire. She just underwrote a $20 million commercial acquisition for my real estate firm yesterday morning. She is the anchor capital for my entire new portfolio. And you just sat there, in your cheap suit, and called her a burden. The oxygen was completely sucked out of the room. The crackling fire in the hearth seemed to provide absolutely no warmth as the freezing reality of their doom settled over my parents and my brother. They were bankrupt. They were facing foreclosure. They had banked their entire survival on manipulating this billionaire. And the billionaire had just revealed that he answered directly to me. The silence was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. Trent was the first to physically react. He lunged forward, grabbing a leather-bound portfolio off the coffee table with trembling, clammy hands. His knuckles were bone white as he frantically tried to pivot the conversation back to his fabricated reality. "Elias, please!" Trent stammered, his voice cracking and pitching high like a panicked teenager. "Let us just sit down and look at the actual numbers. My sister has her little projects, and that is fantastic for her. But I am offering you ground floor equity in a disruptive technology. I have the pitch deck right here. The user acquisition metrics are climbing daily. We just need the $10 million seed capital to scale our server capacity and finalize the proprietary algorithm. I can double your investment in 18 months. Trent practically shoved the expensive tablet toward Elias, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. Richard scrambled to his feet, trying to project his usual arrogant authority, but his knees visibly buckled. "Yes, Elias," my father interjected, offering a sickly, wavering smile. "Let us not get distracted by family trivia. Trent is the real visionary here. He has the mind for global markets. Naomi just handles food and parties. It is a completely different tier of business. We brought you here to discuss a massive technological breakthrough." Elias Harrison did not take the tablet. He did not even look at the glowing screen displaying Trent's colorful, utterly fraudulent bar graphs. He stared at Richard and Trent with an expression of such profound disgust it made my father physically flinch. "You did not tell me your sister was Naomi," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded total submission. "You pitched me for 6 months, Trent. You sent my acquisitions team hundreds of emails bragging about your elite family background and your unparalleled business pedigree. Yet you conveniently failed to mention that the CEO of the hospitality group I just partnered with, the very woman underwriting my entire commercial portfolio, was your own flesh and blood." Trent swallowed audibly. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple, staining the collar of his expensive dress shirt. "Elias, I did not think it was relevant," Trent squeaked, his confident tech founder persona entirely evaporating. "Our businesses are separate. I am building a software empire. I need that $10 million to execute my vision. You promised me a fair hearing tonight. You said if the numbers made sense, you would sign the term sheet." Elias let out a cold, booming laugh that carried absolutely zero humor. It was a sharp, biting sound that echoed off the stone fireplace. "You think I am going to write a $10 million check to a man who openly mocks a $50 million chief executive in his own living room?" Elias asked, stepping closer to Trent, forcing my brother to cower back against the sofa. "You think I am going to trust my capital to a supposed visionary who cannot even recognize the most powerful, successful investor sitting right inside his own house?" Elias slowly buttoned his cashmere overcoat, signaling the absolute end of the meeting before it had even officially begun. "Besides, Trent, I do not make investments without the direct, explicit approval of my lead underwriter. That is a strict corporate policy." Elias turned his body, gesturing entirely toward me. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped in front of my plain black uniform, radiating absolute authority. "If you want $10 million of my money," Elias continued smoothly, "you will have to ask Naomi. She holds the purse strings for my new ventures. Pitch her." The color completely drained from Trent's face, leaving him looking like a reanimated corpse. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The sheer terror in his eyes was intoxicating. For 35 years, he had treated me like dirt beneath his shoes. He had commanded me to cook his midnight snacks. He had laughed while my mother pushed me into a blizzard. Now, his entire fraudulent existence hung entirely on my word. Patricia finally found her voice, letting out a sharp, hysterical gasp. "Naomi, tell him to sign the papers," my mother commanded, falling back on her lifelong habit of issuing aggressive orders. "Tell Mr. Harrison to give your brother the money. We are your family. You owe us this. You have plenty of money now, clearly. Do not be selfish and ruin your brother's future over a silly grudge." I did not look at Patricia. I kept my gaze locked entirely on Trent. My brother was physically shaking, his expensive tablet trembling in his hands. "Pitch me, Trent," I said, my voice echoing the exact cold, dismissive tone he had used on me my entire life. "Show me the proprietary algorithm. Show me the overseas developer contracts. Show me the actual, verified bank statements showing where Richard and Patricia's retirement funds have been going for the past 3 years." Trent let out a strangled, breathless choke. The tablet slipped from his sweaty grip, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. He knew that I knew. He realized in that exact second that his fake user metrics and flashy pitch deck would not survive 5 seconds of actual forensic scrutiny. "Naomi, please," Trent begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic, whimpering whisper. "I need this capital. I have obligations. I have debts. The servers, the developers, everything is on the line. If I do not get this funding tonight, the company goes under, the house goes under, everything is gone. Please, just authorize the investment. You are my sister." I tilted my head, studying him like a fascinating, pathetic insect. "You want $10 million of my money, Trent?" I asked softly. "You want me to authorize a massive wire transfer to a company that does not actually exist? To a company that spends its capital on luxury sports cars and beachfront condos for a 22-year-old fitness influencer in Miami?" Richard let out a sharp, confused gasp. "What are you talking about, Naomi?" my father demanded, stepping forward. "What fitness influencer? Trent's company is heavily invested in server infrastructure. We have seen the expense reports." I smiled, a slow, ruthless expression that finally mirrored the predator Elias Harrison had been playing all night. "You have seen the expense reports Trent forged for you, Richard," I corrected him easily. "You mortgaged this entire estate to fund a complete illusion. There is no software. There is no artificial intelligence. Trent has been funneling your entire life savings directly into his personal slush fund. And I am absolutely not going to throw $10 million of clean corporate capital into his burning dumpster fire of a life." Patricia screamed, clutching her diamond necklace as if she were being physically strangled. "You are lying," she shrieked, her face turning a violent shade of crimson. "You are just a jealous, bitter, lying girl. Trent is a genius. You are making this up to humiliate him because you have always hated him." I did not need to argue with her. I did not need to raise my voice or defend my claims. Because right on cue, the heavy oak front door of the Aspen estate swung open. The final piece of my meticulously crafted trap had arrived, and she was carrying the exact documentation required to blow my family's entire world into absolute oblivion. The heavy oak front door of the Aspen estate did not just swing open, it was pushed wide with a commanding force that sent a fresh blast of sub-zero mountain air sweeping through the grand foyer. The freezing gust carried a swirl of snowflakes across the polished hardwood floors, but nobody in the living room shivered from the cold. They were already frozen to the bone by the sheer terror of their collapsing reality. Stepping through the threshold was Jada. She did not look like the quiet, submissive wife my family had spent the last 3 years treating like a decorative afterthought. She looked like an absolute conqueror. Jada wore her stunning emerald green pantsuit, paired with a tailored black cashmere overcoat that draped elegantly over her shoulders. She stepped into the foyer, her expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the floorboards. She pulled off her leather gloves with slow, methodical precision, her expression completely unreadable as she took in the scene playing out in the living room. In her right hand, she carried the heavy, overloaded leather briefcase containing the forensic audit of Trent's entire miserable existence. Trent spun around at the sound of the door closing. The blood had already drained from his face thanks to my revelations. But seeing his wife suddenly appear in the middle of his imploding pitch meeting sent him into a frantic, irrational state of defensive anger. He was a cornered rat, desperately looking for someone, anyone, he could still control. He mistakenly believed Jada was still that person. "Jada, what on earth are you doing here?" Trent barked, his voice cracking violently as he tried to project an authority he no longer possessed. "We are in the middle of a highly sensitive executive meeting. I explicitly told you to stay at the Denver penthouse tonight. You are completely ruining the optics of this pitch." Patricia, ever the arrogant matriarch, immediately chimed in, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire financial future had just been vaporized. "Jada, this is incredibly inappropriate," my mother hissed, clutching her diamond necklace. "Mr. Harrison is a very important guest. Wives do not interrupt business negotiations. If you absolutely had to come, you should have used the garage entrance. Go wait in the guest wing immediately before you embarrass Trent any further." Jada did not blink. She did not apologize. She did not even acknowledge Patricia's ridiculous command. She simply locked eyes with Trent and began walking slowly and deliberately toward the center of the living room. Each step she took echoed with a terrifying finality. Elias Harrison, the billionaire investor they were so desperate to impress, leaned back against the mantel of the roaring stone fireplace. He crossed his arms over his chest, watching Jada's entrance with deep, appreciative interest. He recognized a fellow predator stepping into the hunting ground. I stood beside him, still wearing my plain black catering uniform, a slow and satisfied smile spreading across my face as my sister-in-law took center stage. Jada reached the heavy oak coffee table situated between the plush leather sofas. She looked down at the expensive tablet Trent had dropped onto the floor, the screen still glowing with his fabricated financial projections. Jada let out a sharp, cynical laugh that cut through the tension in the room like a scalpel. She lifted her heavy leather briefcase and dropped it directly onto the center of the coffee table. The massive thud rattled the crystal wine glasses I had poured just minutes prior. "Jada, have you lost your mind?" Trent demanded, his panic escalating as he took a defensive step backward. "Pick that up and get out of here right now. You are making me look incompetent in front of Elias." "You do not need my help to look incompetent, Trent," Jada replied, her voice smooth, level, and radiating absolute power. "You manage to do that perfectly well all by yourself every single time you open your mouth to lie." Richard finally stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and rage. "See here, young lady," my father bellowed, trying to regain control of his household. "I will not have you speaking to my son this way in my home. We are currently dealing with a severe internal crisis caused by Naomi. We do not need your emotional outbursts adding to the confusion. Return to Denver immediately." Jada slowly turned her head to look at my father. "Richard," she said, her tone dripping with absolute ice, "you do not own this home. The bank owns this home. Or rather, they did until they sold your defaulted, toxic secondary mortgage to a private holding company. You are bankrupt. You are standing in a house you can no longer afford because you handed your entire life savings to the pathetic, lying child cowering next to you." Richard gasped, clutching his chest as if he had been physically struck. Patricia let out a strangled cry, sinking back into her leather chair. Trent looked at Jada with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the submissive woman he thought he married was a complete illusion. Jada unclasped the twin brass locks on her briefcase. The loud metallic clicks echoed like a judge's gavel. She opened the lid and reached inside, pulling out a thick, meticulously organized stack of legal documents. She held them up for Trent to see. "For 3 years, you and your parents treated me like a silent accessory," Jada said, stepping around the coffee table to close the distance between her and my brother. "You thought I was just a pretty face to parade around the country club. You thought I was too stupid to notice the late nights, the unexplained credit card charges, and the massive withdrawals from your parents' retirement accounts. You thought you could just hand me a fake smile and go back to funding your fantasy life." Trent raised his hands in a weak, trembling gesture of surrender. Jada, please, baby, listen to me. I can explain everything. The business is just going through a transitional phase. We are about to secure $10 million. We are going to be fine. Jada did not soften. She did not waver. She stared directly into the eyes of the man who had betrayed her, manipulated her, and stolen from his own family to fund a secret life. I am not here as your wife, Trent, Jada stated, her voice ringing out with absolute devastating clarity. I am here as an independent forensic auditor, and I am serving you with divorce papers. With a swift, fluid motion, Jada slapped the heavy stack of legal documents directly onto Trent's chest. He reflexively brought his hands up to catch them, clutching the divorce petition and the financial audit as if they were a live grenade. The color drained from his face completely. The room spun around the villains of my story, their entire, carefully constructed universe collapsing into absolute ruin. Jada stepped back, standing shoulder to shoulder with me, ready to unleash the rest of her arsenal. Trent fumbled the massive stack of legal documents against his chest, his hands shaking so violently that several pages slipped from the binder and fluttered to the expensive Persian rug. He looked down at the bold black lettering of the divorce petition, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Before he could formulate a single pathetic excuse, Jada reached back into her open leather briefcase. She was not finished. She was just getting started. Jada pulled out a secondary, color-coded folder and held it high for the entire room to see. Richard and Patricia stared at the thick file, their eyes wide with a growing, nauseating sense of dread. For the past 6 months, Jada announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the Aspen estate, I have been tracing every single dollar that flowed into your highly touted technology startup. You told your parents you needed massive capital for overseas developers. You told them you needed dedicated server space and proprietary artificial intelligence algorithms. You convinced them to liquidate their entire retirement portfolios and take out a maximum equity loan on this very house. Richard took a tentative, shaking step forward. Jada, what are you saying? He asked, his voice entirely stripped of its usual arrogance. Trent showed us the user acquisition charts. We saw the corporate expense reports. We reviewed the data together. You saw fabricated spreadsheets designed by a man who does not even know how to write basic computer code, Jada shot back, her gaze cutting right through my father. I audited the routing numbers personally. The corporate accounts you wired your life savings into were simply personal slush funds. Trent has not spent a single dime on technology. Jada opened the folder and extracted a glossy stack of bank statements and printed photographs. She tossed them directly onto the oak coffee table, right next to Trent's useless tablet. The top photograph showed a stunning, 22-year-old woman posing in a designer bikini in front of a luxury oceanfront high-rise. Patricia let out a confused, breathless gasp, stepping closer to the table. "Who is that?" she demanded, her hands fluttering nervously around her diamond necklace. "Is that one of his software engineers?" Jada let out a sharp, humorless laugh that chilled the room. "That is a fitness influencer in Miami, Patricia. Her name is Lexi, and she is the actual recipient of your retirement fund. While you were locking your daughter out in a deadly blizzard for not cooking a steak, your son was busy wiring your money to Florida to pay for his mistress." The silence in the room was absolute, shattered only by the crackling of the stone fireplace. Jada began reading directly from the highlighted bank statements, her voice ringing with ruthless forensic precision. Last month, Trent authorized a wire transfer of $40,000 to pay for a full-year lease on her beachfront condo, Jada stated, dropping the first bank statement onto the table. 2 months ago, he used the exact funds from your secondary mortgage to purchase 2 brand-new imported sports cars, both registered entirely in her name to avoid my marital asset checks. He even paid off her $80,000 private student loans using the money you specifically earmarked for his imaginary server infrastructure. The reality of total, inescapable ruin crashed down upon my parents. The illusion of their golden child was completely vaporized, replaced by the horrifying truth that they had financed their own bankruptcy to fund a cheating, embezzling fraud. Patricia let out a blood-curdling, agonizing scream. It was not her usual theatrical performance meant to garner sympathy. It was the visceral, unfiltered shriek of a woman watching her entire high society identity burn to ash. She clutched her chest, her emerald gown twisting as she collapsed backward into her leather chair, gasping wildly for air. Her precious social status, her wealth, her arrogant pride, it was all completely gone. Richard turned a violent, unnatural shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged fiercely against his stiff collar. The man who had spent his life projecting dignified authority suddenly snapped into pure primal rage. He let out a feral roar and lunged directly across the coffee table, his hands outstretched, aiming straight for Trent's throat. "You stole everything!" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking with absolute devastation. "I mortgaged my home for you! You ruined us!" Before Richard's hands could wrap around Trent's neck, the large, silent man who had accompanied Elias Harrison stepped effortlessly into the fray. The billionaire's private security detail, a highly trained professional who had been standing quietly by the front door, moved with terrifying speed. He intercepted my father mid-lunge, grabbing Richard by the shoulders and shoving him firmly back against the leather sofa. The security guard planted himself like a brick wall between the furious father and the cowering son, easily subduing Richard's frantic, desperate struggling. Trent collapsed onto the floor, the divorce papers scattering around his knees. The arrogant, smug tech founder who had toasted my freezing misery from his heated bedroom just days ago was completely gone. He was reduced to a sobbing, hyperventilating mess. He scrambled on his hands and knees, tears streaming down his face as he looked up at the woman who had just dismantled his life. "Jada, please!" Trent wailed, his voice thick with snot and sheer panic. "Please, I will get the money back. I can sell the cars. I can fix this. Just keep this in the family. We can handle this privately. Do not destroy my life. I am begging you." I stood next to Jada, watching the golden child beg for mercy from the floor. He had shown me zero mercy when I was bleeding and freezing in the snow. He deserved absolutely none in return. Jada looked down at her soon-to-be ex-husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. "Keep it in the family?" she asked, her voice deadly calm. "You gave up the right to family privacy the second you started stealing from them to fund your lies. You do not get to fix this, Trent." Trent reached out, his trembling fingers hovering inches from Jada's expensive leather boots, terrified to actually touch her. "I will sign whatever you want," he sobbed. "You can have everything in the divorce. Just do not go to the police. I cannot go to jail. I will not survive in jail." Jada leaned down slightly, ensuring her words carried the absolute weight of finality. "You are a little too late for negotiations, Trent. I am a licensed auditor. I have a strict legal and ethical obligation to report major financial crimes. I did not just bring these files here tonight to humiliate you." Trent froze, his crying hitching in his throat as the true magnitude of his situation finally dawned on him. "I finalized the audit 48 hours ago," Jada stated, standing tall and crossing her arms over her cashmere coat. "I already handed the entire encrypted dossier over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Wire Fraud Division has your bank records, your forged investor documents, and the communications with your mistress across state lines. They are currently securing federal warrants for your arrest." Trent let out a strangled, breathless gasp, his eyes rolling back slightly as if he were about to pass out. He slumped sideways onto the expensive Persian rug, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unavoidable reality of his fate. He was not just facing a messy divorce and angry, bankrupt parents. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The crushing weight of Trent's impending federal indictment hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He curled into a pathetic, trembling ball on the expensive Persian rug, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unavoidable reality of his fate. He was not just facing a messy divorce and angry, bankrupt parents, he was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I stepped forward, moving smoothly around the coffee table where the divorce papers and the forensic audit lay scattered. The room was perfectly primed for my next maneuver. My parents were completely shattered by the revelation of their stolen retirement funds. But I was not about to let them play the victims. They were co-conspirators in my lifelong abuse, and it was time to address the legal war they had foolishly initiated against me just 48 hours prior. I looked down at Patricia. She was still slumped in her leather chair, clutching her chest, gasping for air as her entire high society identity burned to ash. Beside her, Richard was still pinned against the sofa by Elias Harrison's security guard, his face a mask of absolute despair. They had lost their money and their golden child in one fell swoop, but they still needed to answer for what they had done to me. "Richard," I said, my voice cutting through Trent's pathetic sobbing. "Let us talk about that brilliant legal strategy you and your high-priced defense attorney cooked up yesterday morning. Let us discuss the $100,000 civil lawsuit you served me with while I was recovering from mild frostbite in my hotel room." Richard blinked, struggling to focus his eyes on me. The sheer volume of catastrophic information he had absorbed in the last 10 minutes had completely short-circuited his brain. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Patricia suddenly bolted upright, her survival instincts kicking in. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "You destroyed our property!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "You smashed a custom glass window. You had a psychotic break and attacked us. We had every right to file a restraining order to protect our family from your violent delusions." I smiled, reaching into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out the small metallic digital recorder Jada had handed me in the Denver law office. I held it up so the firelight glinted off its smooth surface. "That is a fascinating narrative, Mom," I replied, my tone perfectly conversational. "You swore under penalty of perjury that I was entirely out of my mind. You signed an official affidavit claiming you gently asked me to step outside to calm down, and that I responded with unprovoked violence. You told the judge I was a dangerous, drug-addicted culinary worker trying to ruin the family Christmas." I pressed my thumb against the playback button and turned the volume all the way up. I set the digital recorder down right next to Jada's massive forensic audit folder. The audio quality was exceptionally clear. The quiet, tense atmosphere of the Aspen living room was suddenly filled with the unmistakable, high-fidelity sounds of the blizzard from 2 nights ago. Everyone in the room heard the heavy oak front door slam open. They heard Trent slurring his words, drunkenly demanding a Wagyu steak at 1 in the morning. They heard my calm, exhausted refusal. Then, Patricia's voice echoed from the small speaker, sharp, vicious, and entirely unhinged. "You are a glorified line cook, Naomi. Do not act like you are running a multinational corporation." Patricia physically recoiled in her chair, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she heard her own voice playing back to her. Richard stared at the recorder in absolute horror. The audio continued, capturing every single second of the assault. The sound of Patricia snatching my keys and my coat. The violent, unmistakable thud of her shoving me toward the patio door. My desperate, panicked voice begging her to stop because it was -10 degrees outside. Then came the fatal, undeniable crescendo. "You want to act like you are too good to serve this family?" the recorded version of Patricia screamed. "Then you can learn what it means to be cut off. Let us see how independent you are freezing in the snow." The sound of the heavy glass door slamming shut resonated through the living room. The distinct, metallic click of the deadbolt locking me outside was deafening. And finally, the audio captured Patricia's parting words, shouted through the glass with absolute venomous cruelty. "Servants sleep outside." I reached out and stopped the recording. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Elias Harrison let out a slow, disgusted exhale, shaking his head as he looked at my parents. He had seen ruthless corporate takeovers, but the sheer, sociopathic cruelty displayed by my family clearly repulsed him. "You lied to the police," I stated, my voice ringing with total authority. "You lied to the county court. You signed sworn affidavits claiming I was a violent, psychotic threat to this family, completely unaware that your daughter-in-law was standing in the hallway, recording every single second of your domestic abuse." Richard slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. The fight completely drained out of him. He knew exactly what this meant. He was not just bankrupt. He was legally doomed. "My legal team received this audio file yesterday morning," I explained, pacing slowly in front of the coffee table. "We did not call you to brag about it. We simply took this digital recording straight to the presiding judge. Your frivolous $100,000 civil lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice less than an hour after it was filed. Your fabricated restraining order was instantly voided." Patricia let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. "Naomi, please," she begged, her arrogant facade entirely shattered. "We were just angry. We were trying to protect Trent's reputation. You cannot use that recording against us. We will drop the lawsuit. We will apologize. We will do whatever you want." I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of her. "It is far too late for apologies, Patricia. I did not just have my lawyers dismiss your ridiculous lawsuit. I had them file a massive countersuit against both of you." I leaned in closer, ensuring she heard every single syllable. "We are suing you for defamation of character, malicious prosecution, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But the civil suit is the least of your worries. My lead attorney formally submitted this audio recording to the district attorney's office this afternoon. By signing those fake affidavits, you committed blatant, undeniable perjury. You lied to a judge to cover up a domestic violence incident." Richard lifted his head from his hands, his eyes red and rimmed with unshed tears. He looked at me like I was a complete stranger. "You are sending us to jail," he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. "You are sending your own parents to a state penitentiary over a broken window." "I am not sending you anywhere, Richard," I corrected him coldly. "Your own lies are sending you to prison. You tried to weaponize the legal system to crush a woman you thought was a helpless, broke cook. You thought you could use your wealthy status to erase my reality and lock me away in a psychiatric ward. You threw the first punch in a legal war, completely unaware that I had the capital, the legal team, and the absolute proof to utterly annihilate you." The absolute finality of my words settled over them. They had no money to hire a defense attorney. Trent had embezzled every last cent of their retirement funds. They were facing multiple felony charges for perjury and filing false police reports, alongside my brutal civil suit. Their reputations, their freedom, and their financial security were completely eradicated in a matter of minutes. But I was not finished. The criminal charges and the divorce papers were just the opening acts. I still had one final, devastating card to play, and it was going to strip them of the very ground they were standing on. The room felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Richard stared at me, his chest heaving as the catastrophic reality of his situation finally pierced through his decades of manufactured arrogance. He looked at the shattered remains of his golden child weeping on the Persian rug. He looked at his wife, paralyzed by the sheer terror of impending felony perjury charges. And then, he looked at the massive, opulent Aspen estate surrounding us. The vaulted timber ceilings, the roaring stone fireplace, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the snow-covered mountains. This house was his ultimate trophy. It was the physical manifestation of the fake empire he had spent his entire life projecting to the world. And he was about to lose it all. I watched the exact moment my father's pride completely fractured. The realization that Trent had embezzled their entire retirement fund to buy sports cars for a mistress meant Richard had absolutely zero liquid assets left to defend himself. He had no money for criminal defense attorneys. He had no money to settle the civil lawsuits. He did not even have the money to keep the lights on in this multi-million-dollar mansion. The bank was coming for the property, and he knew he was completely powerless to stop them. Richard's legs gave out. The man who had sneered at me, who had proudly enabled my mother's abuse, physically collapsed. He dropped heavily onto his knees, right in the center of the living room. The thud of his knees hitting the hardwood floor echoed loudly. Elias Harrison's security guard took a step back, allowing my father to crawl forward on the expensive rug. "Naomi!" Richard choked out, his voice a pathetic, ragged wheeze. He held his hands up, palms open, an active gesture of total surrender. "Please, you have to help us. You have to. You have to stop this." I looked down at him, my expression perfectly smooth. "Help you do what, Richard? Dodge federal perjury charges? Or cover up the fact that your son is facing a decade in prison for wire fraud?" "The house," Richard begged, tears freely streaming down his weathered cheeks. "The bank is going to take the house. We are 3 months behind on the secondary mortgage. Trent told us he needed the equity for server space, and we gave him everything. We have absolutely nothing left in our accounts. If the bank forecloses, your mother and I will be homeless. We will be out on the street." He crawled another inch forward, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. "You are a multimillionaire, Naomi. Elias just said you run a $50 million company. You underwrite $20 million commercial funds. You have the capital. You can pay off the arrears. You can give us a loan to save the estate. We are blood. You cannot just stand there and let the bank throw your own parents out into the cold. You have millions. You have to save this house." Patricia let out a loud, miserable sob from her chair, burying her face in her hands. Trent continued to whimper on the floor, his face pressed into the carpet. They were all waiting for me to suddenly revert to the obedient, desperate daughter who craved their approval. They actually thought my immense wealth would be their ultimate salvation. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not reach down to help my father off his knees. Instead, I slowly turned and walked back to the oak coffee table. Jada stood there, her arms crossed, a knowing glint in her sharp eyes. I reached into her open leather briefcase and bypassed the divorce papers and the criminal audit. I reached all the way to the bottom and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope stamped with the seal of a prominent commercial bank. I walked back to my father and stood directly over him. I tapped the thick envelope against my palm, the crisp sound cutting through Patricia's sobbing. "You are right about one thing, Richard," I said, my voice echoing with absolute freezing clarity. "I do have millions. I have the exact amount of capital required to instantly wipe out your secondary mortgage. I have the resources to completely satisfy your distressed debt in a single, automated wire transfer." Richard let out a shaky, desperate breath of relief, reaching a trembling hand up toward the envelope. "Thank God," he whispered, a sickly smile trying to form on his lips. "I knew you would not let us lose everything. I knew you would do the right thing for your family." I pulled the envelope back, keeping it entirely out of his reach. "I am not doing anything for this family," I corrected him coldly. "And I do not have to save the house, Richard, because I already did." I pulled the heavy stack of legal documents from the envelope and let them unfold. The bold black text at the top of the first page read, "Notice of foreclosure and transfer of lien." I held the document down so Richard could see the official bank stamps and the bold, undeniable signatures at the bottom. "When my legal team uncovered the fact that you had leveraged this entire estate to fund Trent's fraudulent startup, I made a very quick, very aggressive business decision," I explained, pacing slowly around his kneeling form. "You see, the commercial bank holding your secondary mortgage knew you were a massive liability. You were 90 days delinquent. Your debt was officially classified as highly distressed and toxic. The bank desperately wanted to offload the risk before the property went into a messy, prolonged foreclosure battle." Richard stared at the papers, his eyes darting frantically across the legal jargon, his brain struggling to process the information. "So, I had my corporate attorneys contact your lender yesterday afternoon," I continued, my voice steady and merciless. "We used a blind limited liability company registered in Delaware, a subsidiary entirely owned and controlled by my hospitality group. We offered the bank a cash buyout for your toxic debt at a steep discount. They accepted the offer immediately. The wire transfer cleared this morning. I stopped pacing and stood right in front of him, dropping the legal documents directly onto the floor in front of his knees. The bank does not own this house anymore, Richard, I stated, delivering the absolute, crushing final blow. My limited liability company bought your defaulted debt. I am your primary lien holder. I am the sole owner of your mortgage, and because you are severely in default, I have the absolute legal authority to accelerate the foreclosure process without a single day of grace period. The air left Richard's lungs in a violent, rushing gasp. He stared at the foreclosure notice, his hands hovering over the paper as if it were burning hot. I do not have to save this house, I repeated, looking down at the man who had allowed my mother to shove me into a blizzard. Because I already own this house. Patricia shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. She scrambled out of her leather chair, her designer heels slipping on the hardwood floor. You bought our house? She screamed, her voice cracking violently. You bought our debt? You cannot do that. It is illegal. It is our home. It is perfectly legal, Patricia, Jada interjected, stepping forward with a sharp, victorious smile. It is a standard commercial debt acquisition. Naomi is a registered corporate entity. She purchased a distressed asset. It just happens that the distressed asset is the very roof over your head. Trent curled tighter into a ball on the floor, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched moan. He finally understood the absolute, inescapable finality of my trap. He had not just ruined his own life, he had handed me the exact weapon needed to legally conquer our parents. I looked around the grand living room, admiring the vaulted timber ceilings and the roaring stone fireplace. It really is a beautiful piece of real estate, I noted casually, looking back down at my kneeling father. It has excellent commercial potential. I think it will make a fantastic corporate retreat for my executive team once we clear out the current occupants. Richard looked up at me, his face completely devoid of color, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. You are going to evict us, he whispered, the reality finally breaking his spirit completely. You are going to throw your own parents out on the street. I smiled, a cold, empty expression that contained absolutely zero mercy. I stared directly into my father's terrified eyes, preparing to deliver the exact sentence they had earned. I am not evicting you, Richard, I clarified, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any lingering familial warmth. Eviction implies you have tenant rights. It implies a lengthy legal process with 30 days of notice and court hearings. But you are not a tenant. You are a defaulted debtor occupying an asset that completely belongs to my corporation. And as of this morning, when my legal team finalized the accelerated foreclosure transfer, you officially became trespassers on my private property. Richard let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, his hands clutching his chest, as if he were trying to hold his very heart in place. The reality of his absolute ruin was suffocating him. He looked up at me, a man completely broken by his own astronomical hubris. You cannot do this to us, Naomi, he pleaded, his voice a jagged, raspy whisper. We have nowhere to go. Our bank accounts are completely empty. Trent drained everything we had. If you throw us out tonight, we have absolutely nothing. We do not even have money for a hotel room. I tilted my head, studying him with the clinical detachment of a predator observing a cornered prey. I find it utterly fascinating that you expect me to care about your lack of shelter, I replied smoothly. Just 48 hours ago, you stood by and watched as I was physically shoved into a deadly mountain blizzard. You did not offer me a hotel room then. You did not care if I froze to death on your patio. You went back to sleep in your heated mansion. So please, spare me the pathetic appeals to my humanity. You forfeited the right to my compassion the second you locked that glass door. Patricia suddenly scrambled forward on her hands and knees. Her emerald green evening gown dragged across the spilled red wine, soaking the expensive fabric in a dark, blood-like stain. She ignored the mess entirely, reaching out to desperately grab the hem of Elias Harrison's tailored cashmere overcoat. "Mr. Harrison, please," Patricia wailed, her face contorted into an ugly, weeping mask of sheer terror. "You are a reasonable man. You are a respected billionaire. You cannot stand there and watch this psychotic girl throw her own elderly parents out into the freezing snow. You have to stop her. Tell her to give us time. Tell her this is completely unacceptable." Elias looked down at Patricia with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. He deliberately took a large step backward, forcing her to release her desperate grip on his coat. He smoothed the fabric with a gloved hand, acting as if she had just soiled his clothing with a toxic substance. "I am a businessman, Patricia," Elias stated, his booming voice echoing with absolute freezing authority. "And as a businessman, I hold the utmost respect for aggressively executed perfectly legal financial maneuvers." Naomi identified a toxic asset, purchased the distressed debt, and is currently enforcing her rightful claim to the property. It is brilliant. It is flawless. And quite frankly, after witnessing the horrifying way you treat your own blood, I consider it an act of profound poetic justice. Elias gestured to the massive, silent security guard standing near the front door. "Furthermore, I am a guest on Naomi's private property. If she asks my security detail to assist in removing unwanted trespassers from her estate, we will be more than happy to oblige. I strongly suggest you stop crying and start packing before things get physical." Patricia let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. She spun around to face Jada, who was still standing tall and composed next to the coffee table. "Jada, do something!" Patricia shrieked, tears ruining her expensive, carefully applied makeup. "Trent is your husband. We are your family. You cannot just hand these financial records over and watch us get thrown onto the street. Talk some sense into her." Jada looked down at my mother, her sharp eyes flashing with triumphant, icy resolve. "Trent is a federal criminal facing decades in a penitentiary," Jada corrected her coldly. "And you are a cruel, narcissistic enabler who spent 3 years treating me like an invisible accessory. I did not bring this forensic audit here to save you, Patricia. I brought it here to ensure you never have the opportunity to victimize another human being ever again. You dug this grave with your own arrogance. Now you get to lie in it." The utter finality of Jada's words completely shattered any remaining sliver of hope my parents had been clinging to. They were entirely surrounded by enemies they had created themselves. They had no money, no legal standing, and absolutely no one left to manipulate. I walked over to the large insulated catering bags I had hauled up the service path earlier that evening. I unzipped the side compartment of the heaviest bag. I reached inside and pulled out a tightly rolled bundle of fabric. It was the exact thin, cheap, worn-out wool cardigan Patricia had violently ripped off the back of my chair. It was the very same sweater she had forcefully thrown into the sub-zero blizzard before locking me outside to die. I had retrieved it from the snowbank before leaving for the hospital. I walked back to where Patricia was still kneeling on the wine-soaked rug. I held the crumpled sweater up, letting the cheap fabric unroll. I looked directly into my mother's terrified, weeping eyes, and I dropped the freezing, stiff sweater directly at her feet. "You have exactly 1 hour to pack your things and vacate my property," I announced, my voice carrying zero emotion, zero hesitation, and zero mercy. "You will take only your personal clothing and basic toiletries. You will pack them into black plastic garbage bags. You will not take any jewelry, any artwork, or any furniture. Every single valuable item inside this estate now legally belongs to my corporation to satisfy your massive outstanding debt." Trent, still curled in a pathetic ball on the floor, let out a loud, miserable groan. He scrambled onto his knees, his hands shaking wildly as he looked at the divorce papers scattered around him. "Naomi, please," Trent begged, his voice high and reedy. "I cannot go out there. The federal authorities are going to be looking for me. I need to stay here. I need to figure out a legal defense." I turned my cold gaze to my brother. "Your legal defense is not my concern, Trent. You have 58 minutes left. If you are not off my property by the time the clock strikes the hour, I will instruct Mr. Harrison's security detail to physically drag you out by your collar and throw you onto the icy driveway. I suggest you stop crying and start filling those garbage bags." Richard slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his entire body trembling like a fragile, hollow shell of the man he used to be. He looked at his wife, who was still paralyzed by the cheap sweater resting at her feet. "Get up, Patricia," Richard muttered, his voice devoid of all life and spirit. "She is not bluffing. She is going to let us freeze. We have to pack. We have to go." Patricia stared at the cheap sweater lying on the floor. She looked up at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the mountain storm was still raging, whipping violent sheets of snow against the reinforced glass. The temperature was plunging well below zero. "Naomi, you cannot do this!" Patricia wailed, her voice cracking into a frantic, desperate sob. "It is an absolute blizzard outside. We will freeze. We have no cars. Trent sold them. We have nowhere to go. We cannot sleep out there in the storm. We will die." I stared down at her, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace washing over my entire soul. The decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the theft of my college fund, and the horrifying attempt on my life had all permanently extinguished my capacity for forgiveness. I looked her dead in the eye, my expression completely stone cold, and I echoed the exact, vicious words she had screamed at me through the glass door just 2 nights ago. "Servants sleep outside." Patricia let out a guttural, defeated wail, finally comprehending the absolute finality of my decree. She snatched the cheap wool sweater from the floor, clutching it to her chest as if it were her only remaining lifeline. Richard grabbed her arm, practically dragging her toward the grand staircase. They had less than 50 minutes to pack their entire lives into heavy-duty black garbage bags. I stood by the fireplace, watching them scramble like terrified mice. Trent did not move. He remained curled on the Persian rug, surrounded by the divorce papers Jada had served him. He was hyperventilating, muttering nonsensical apologies to no one in particular. Jada looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated indifference. She had already detached herself from his sinking ship, and watching him drown evoked absolutely zero sympathy from her. Elias Harrison and his security detail remained by the door, ensuring none of my newly evicted debtors attempted to steal any fixtures or valuable artwork on their way out. The sheer humiliation of packing trash bags under the watchful eye of a billionaire investor completely broke whatever fragile pride my parents had left. Suddenly, the harsh, blinding flash of red and blue lights pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the snow-covered driveway. The lights were not from local police. A convoy of dark, heavy sport utility vehicles plowed through the mounting snowdrifts, coming to a sharp halt right in front of the estate. The heavy oak front door swung open once more, and 5 federal agents stepped into the foyer. Their jackets bore the unmistakable bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent bypassed everyone in the room, his eyes locking directly onto my brother. He pulled a folded warrant from his interior pocket. He announced that Trent was being placed under federal arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. Trent let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. He begged our parents for help, screaming that he was too fragile for federal custody. Richard and Patricia, dragging 2 bloated black trash bags down the sweeping staircase, froze in absolute horror. They watched helplessly as federal agents hauled their golden child off the Persian rug, snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The agents dragged Trent out the door, pushing him into the freezing blizzard and tossing him into the back of a black government vehicle. Richard and Patricia stood paralyzed in the foyer, clutching their trash bags. My father looked at me, his eyes hollow, silently pleading for a final ounce of mercy. I checked my watch. "Time is up," I announced, my voice echoing off the vaulted timber ceilings. "Get out!" Elias Harrison stepped aside, allowing his security guard to physically usher my parents out the front door. They stumbled onto the icy porch, shivering violently, as the freezing mountain wind hit them. They had no cars. They had no friends willing to answer their desperate late-night calls. They were forced to stand in the sub-zero blizzard, clutching garbage bags, waiting for a local taxi that would take over an hour to navigate the snowy mountain roads. I stepped forward and firmly closed the heavy oak door. I slid the deadbolt into place with a loud, satisfying click, locking them out in the cold forever. Fast forward 6 months. The dust had settled, and the universe had delivered its absolute, unapologetic justice. Jada was thriving beyond measure. With the meticulous forensic evidence she had gathered, her divorce proceedings were incredibly swift. She easily secured her rightful share of their marital assets and completely insulated herself from the massive financial fallout of Trent's criminal enterprise. She opened her own independent auditing firm in downtown Denver, her reputation skyrocketing after exposing such a high-profile corporate fraud. Trent was exactly where he belonged. A federal judge showed absolutely zero leniency for his multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. My brother was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant, coddled tech founder who used to demand midnight Wagyu steaks was now eating processed cafeteria trays and sleeping on a thin cot surrounded by concrete walls. My parents faced a reality that was, to them, far worse than prison. Without a single dollar to their names and their reputations entirely annihilated, Richard and Patricia were forced to move into a cramped, run-down trailer park on the outskirts of a forgotten industrial town. The high society friends they had worshipped completely shunned them. Their country club memberships were revoked. They spent their days sitting in a tiny, drafty aluminum box, bitterly blaming each other for their total collapse. They had sacrificed their daughter, their morals, and their entire life savings just to maintain an illusion of superiority. Now, they had absolutely nothing but regret. As for me, I found a profound, unshakable peace. I did not sell the Aspen estate. Instead, I poured my capital into a massive state-of-the-art renovation. I completely gutted the rooms where I had been degraded and abused, transforming the sprawling mansion into a luxury culinary academy for underprivileged youth. I provided full scholarships, housing, and elite culinary training to teenagers who had grown up in the foster system or survived abusive households. I gave them the exact support, education, and validation that my family had intentionally denied me. I stood in the newly remodeled, gleaming commercial kitchen of the academy, holding a warm cup of coffee. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the snow-capped mountains. The winter sun reflected brilliantly off the pristine white powder covering the patio. There was no pain left in my chest. There was no lingering anger. The toxic weight of trying to earn the love of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it had been completely lifted from my shoulders. I had built my own empire, saved my own life, and created a warm, safe sanctuary for those who truly needed it. Family is supposed to be your warm shelter, but sometimes they are the blizzard you have to survive. You do not owe your warmth to people who would gladly watch you freeze. Have you ever had to leave toxic family out in the cold? Let me know in the comments below. The harrowing story of Naomi serves as a powerful testament to a difficult but necessary truth. Blood relations do not grant anyone the right to subject you to abuse, and setting immovable boundaries is the ultimate act of self-preservation. From the moment her parents locked her out in a deadly blizzard, reducing her to the status of a disposable servant, the illusion of familial duty was shattered. Society often conditions us to believe that we must endlessly forgive and accommodate toxic relatives simply because we share the same DNA. However, Naomi's journey brilliantly dismantles this harmful narrative. Instead of internalizing the relentless cruelty, gaslighting, and financial manipulation inflicted by her parents and her brother, she chose to recognize her own undeniable worth. She realized that her family's arrogance was a reflection of their own deep-seated flaws and fraudulent lives, rather than a measure of her value. When she legally acquired their defaulted debt and evicted them from the Aspen estate, it was not merely an act of blind vengeance. It was the establishment of a definitive, legally binding boundary. She returned the exact energy they had given her, proving that cruel actions have inescapable consequences. This story teaches us that true family is supposed to be a warm shelter, a place of safety, unconditional support, and mutual respect. When the people who are meant to protect you become the very blizzard you must survive, you possess the absolute right to walk away and build your own empire. We are entirely capable of turning the spaces where we were once degraded into sanctuaries of healing and empowerment. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your life and never be afraid to permanently close the door on those who gladly leave you out in the cold.